The night came down over North London like wet wool. Fog crept along the lanes of Muswell Hill, soft and slow, smelling of coal smoke and frost. The suburb was new then, half-built, half-rural, scattered with detached villas behind iron gates, each holding its own small silence. Gas lamps glowed at long distances, faint as candle flames seen through linen. To the north stretched Coldfall Wood, ancient and unlit, older than any street in London. Frost crackled in its leaves. An owl called once, and was answered. At the wood's edge stood a quiet house called Muswell Lodge. Its shutters were closed. A tripwire ran across the garden, set to fire a gun if disturbed. Inside, a fire had burned down to embers. A clock ticked in the hall. An old man slept upstairs, alone with his keys and his locks and his careful, frightened habits. Through the trees 2 figures moved. They carried a child's tin lantern, no larger than a fist. They paused at the back fence. The fog closed behind them. Somewhere far off, a train whistle thinned into the dark. Chapter 1. The Suburb Beneath the Fog. Good evening. Welcome back, or welcome for the very first time to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now. The world has grown small around you. The lamp by the bed is low. The walls are warm. The hour is late, wherever the listener may be. If the listener would care to tell us, in a word or two below, the town they are listening from tonight, and the hour upon the clock, it would be a kindness. It is good to know who keeps the candle with us. If the story finds them, the small thumb beneath the page may be lifted in quiet approval, and the channel followed, so its slow work may go on. Then settle into the pillow. Loosen the breath. We're going back now, gently, to a winter that ended long ago. Back to a hill on the northern edge of London, where the gas lamps stood far apart, and the cold came up out of the ground. The year is 1896. Queen Victoria has worn her crown for 58 winters. The empire she keeps stretches from Bombay to Belize, from the Cape of Good Hope to the Yangtze River. Her son, the Prince of Wales, is grey at the temple. Her ministers are old men. Her age is everywhere, and so is her smoke. London at this hour is the largest city the world has ever known. 4 million souls live within the ring of its omnibuses. Coal fires burn behind 1 million chimneys. The river runs black beneath its bridges, oily and slow. The sky above is brown in the morning and red at night. On still days, the fog settles over the streets and does not lift for a week. It is a city built outward. The villages that ringed it 100 years before have been taken in, one by one. Hampstead, Highgate, Hornsey, Hendon, Holloway, Haringey, Harrow. 7 more besides, each beginning with the same soft letter. Brick has reached them. Rail has reached them. The fields between them are narrowing every year. An old man, born under King William, might walk out one afternoon from the Bank of England and find streets where once he picked blackberries as a boy. The countryside has not vanished. It has been pushed back, year by year, like a tide that does not return, beyond the inner mile of the city, where the great houses and the warehouses and the river traffic press together. There lies a wider ring of newer towns. Some count them at 40. Some count them at more. Each of these daughter towns is large enough on its own to be the capital of a small country. Each has its own railway station. Each has its own gasworks. Each has its own little high street with a draper, a butcher, a chemist, and a public house. Each is filled in its better quarters with the houses of clerks, merchants, and small gentlemen. They travel into the city of a morning. They return home at dusk. By day the streets are quiet, given over to servants and tradesmen and the children of nursemaids. By night, when the husbands return, the lamps come on behind drawn curtains and the suburb closes upon itself. One of these daughter towns is called Muswell Hill. It sits north of London on a low ridge above the valley of the Moselle Brook. The hill takes its name, the older people say, from a mossy spring that once flowed near the church of St. James, the holy well that gave the place its first form, Muswell. A pilgrim king of Scotland is said to have drunk from it once, long ago, and been cured of his sickness. The well itself is gone now. But the road that climbs to the top of the hill is still the old road that pilgrims came up. It runs north to Colney Hatch and out toward the open country beyond. On a clear day, the dome of St. Paul's may be seen from the upper windows of the higher houses, dark against the smoke. In 1896, the hill is not yet a town. It is becoming one. 20 years before, The Great Northern Railway had opened its small station at the foot of the slope. In those days, the streets above were still a patchwork. Farmland, market gardens, great private estates with avenues of lime trees and walled kitchen gardens and orchards. The Alexandra Palace had risen on the slope to the east in 1873. It burned down within a fortnight of its opening and rose again. Year by year, the lanes have been straightened. Year by year, a builder has bought another field, and a new road has cut across the old hedges, and a row of brick villas has stood up where elms once stood. The estate called the Limes, with its great house on the brow of the hill, is to be auctioned this very spring. It will be parcelled out and laid out for streets. But not yet. Not in February. In February the work has paused for the frost. What stands on the hill then, on this winter night, is a place caught between 2 centuries. There are paved roads, and beside them there are dirt lanes. There are gas lamps on iron standards. Beyond them there are hedges that have not been cut since the time of King William. There are detached villas, each with a name on the gate. Stanley Lodge, Thornton's, Fortesmere, Midhurst, the Firs, each set back from the road within its own walled garden, with laurel and yew and a winter bare apple tree. Between these villas there are still long stretches of nothing at all. A horse pasture, a market garden, a scrap of common ground where a child might fly a kite of a Sunday afternoon. The well-to-do live behind those gates. A retired city merchant in this house, a widow with a daughter in that, a doctor at the corner of the road, his brass plate polished every morning by a girl in a starched cap, a clergyman 3 doors down, who walks each day to St. James's to pray over a parish that is growing too fast for him to know. The husbands take the morning train down to King's Cross or to Moorgate behind newspapers folded into thirds. The wives manage the household, the parlour maid, the cook, the boy who brings up the coal, and pay their calls in the afternoon, leaving small cards on silver trays and halls that smell of beeswax and lavender. The children walk to school, or are walked there by a nurse in coats buttoned to the throat. The grocer's boy whistles up the path with a basket on his arm. The muffin man rings his small bell at 4. The shops close at 8. By 10 the street is empty. The inside of one of these houses, on a winter evening, is a small museum of its century. A coal fire snaps behind a fender of polished brass. A piano stands in a corner, with its lid down, a hymn book and a sheet of Mendelssohn upon it. The mantel carries a clock under a glass dome, 2 china dogs, and a photograph in a silver frame. There is a heavy tablecloth of red plush. There is an oilcloth in the hall. There is the soft, particular smell of gaslight, a smell of warm metal and old air, and the slow hiss of the burners along the wall. A maid passes through a doorway with a tray. A grandfather clock chimes 9. Outside, beyond the heavy curtains, the cold is settling. The water in the rain butt has long since turned to ice. The garden path crackles when a cat crosses it. It is this very stillness that troubles the people of the hill, and troubles them more in the winter than in the summer. The suburb is wealthy. It has plate and silver and good linen and watches under glass on the mantel. It has cash boxes in the bureau drawer. It has, in some houses, more cash than the master of the house would ever admit at his club, and it has in all of these houses fewer people inside than there are rooms. A villa of 8 rooms may sleep 3 souls. The lanes between the villas are dark. The Metropolitan Police, who answer for this huge and growing ring of suburbs, are stretched thin. A constable may pass down a given lane once in an hour, twice if the moon is bright. The rest of the time the suburb watches itself, and it knows in its bones that it cannot watch very well. So there is, in the back of every well-kept mind, a small soft worry, not a panic. The suburb does not panic. The suburb does not even speak of it aloud, but a worry. A worry about the man who is not quite right at the corner of the road. A worry about the unfamiliar face on the late train. A worry about the back gate that may not have been locked. The newspapers print, from time to time, the report of a burglary in one or another of these daughter towns. A silver tea service taken. A bureau broken open. A sleeping householder who heard nothing. The reader of those reports knows the streets in question. The reader of those reports lives 1 street over, or 2. Beyond the last gardens, the open land begins. North and west of the hill, the fields stretch toward Finchley and Hendon, broken by hedges and by the small dark rivers that feed the Moselle. and along one whole western edge, hard against a lane called Tetherdown, once spelt Tatterdown. In the old maps, there runs an old wood. It is called Coldfall. It has been called Coldfall by one spelling or another, since before there were maps of this country at all. The oaks within it are older than the road that skirts it. The ground beneath the oaks holds the rough stones that the great ice sheet pushed down from the north in the long winter before history began. Boys come into the wood by day to gather sticks. Men come into it at twilight after rabbits. After dark, no one comes into it at all. The wood is a wall. Tonight, the wood is silent. The frost has stiffened every leaf. The breath of the few foxes that move within it rises in small clouds and is gone. Above the canopy the sky is the colour of an old coin. There is no moon to speak of, only a paleness behind the cloud. The lamps of the suburb glow far off through the bare branches, small and dim and orange. A train passes somewhere on the line below. The sound of its wheels is carried on the still cold air, long after the carriages themselves have gone. Then there is silence again. Only the slow tick of frost on bark. Only the distant church bell of St. James, marking the half-hour. A fox sets one paw upon a fallen branch and lifts it again, and is gone. Somewhere within this picture, set back behind a hedge, behind iron gates, behind shutters fastened with iron bars, stands a quiet house. Its chimneys do not smoke now. Its windows show no light. Its garden runs down the long slope behind and ends at the back wall of Coldfall Wood. In that house, a man sleeps. He is 79 years old. He has lived alone for many years. He has built, around his life, a careful little fortress of locks and bolts and wires and small mechanical traps, designed and set by his own hand. He believes he is safe. He has every reason to believe so. The night agrees with him. The fog agrees with him. The lamps agree with him. The hour is late. The hill is asleep. 3 miles to the west, on a different road, hansom cab is moving slowly along a curb. The horse is steaming in the cold. The driver is half asleep on his box, his shoulders drawn up under his caped coat. The fare he is waiting for has gone into a tap room and not yet come out. Inside that tap room, the gas jets are turned low. Tobacco smoke hangs blue beneath the ceiling. Men sit at a long table with their hats still on, and their hands around small thick glasses, and they speak in low voices that do not carry across the room. Coins are pushed across the wood. A pencil is wetted with the tongue, and a name is written down. The night has many hours yet to run. The fog thickens. The gas lamps along that western road waver. The city around them, vast and gaslit and unaware, turns gently in its sleep. A clock somewhere strikes 11. A dog barks once in a yard and falls silent. The frost deepens upon the iron railings. The breath of the great city slows. It is February 1896. The hill is still. The wood is still. The candle burns low, and history, in its slow and patient way, has already begun to deal the cards. Chapter 2. The Lodge and its Locks. To find Muswell Lodge in the winter of 1896, one had to leave the high street at the top of the hill and turn into the lane called Tetherdown, which ran down the slope toward the wood at a slow and patient gradient that the carriage horses always took at a walk. The lane was narrow, fringed by old hedges that had been growing there long before the new villas were built, and it ran between fewer than a dozen houses set well apart from one another, each one in its own walled garden, as though they had been planted by different hands in different decades, and had never grown together into a row in the manner of the inner suburbs. The lodge stood about halfway down the lane, on the western side, its long back garden running away down the slope, until it came at last to a wooden boundary fence that pressed up against the edge of Coldfall Wood. The gate before it was iron, painted a dull green, and showed a small spot of rust at the lower hinge where the rain had got in. A bell hung beside the gate post on a curl of bracket. A small brass plate, kept clean by the gardener, gave only the name of the house, and gave it in a plain serif lettering that made no claim of its own. Nothing more was offered to a passer-by, and very few passers-by came that way. A visitor walking up the gravel path between the laurels would have seen, on a winter morning, a square brick house of 2 stories with a slate roof and tall chimneys, built some 30 or 40 years before in the comfortable, plain manner of the middle of the century, when builders had favoured proportion above ornament, and good walls above the showier kind. There were no carved stones above the windows, no scrolls at the eaves, no fanciful gables in the roof, and no painted shutters on the outside. There were only good walls, good windows, a wide front door of dark mahogany with a heavy brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, and a pair of stone steps that led up to that door. A bay window stood to the left of the porch with heavy curtains drawn all ways in heavy folds. A second bay stood above it on the first floor. The grass before the house was kept short by the gardener, and the path of red gravel that ran from the gate to the porch was raked every morning, so that the marks of yesterday's footsteps were always gone before the master had risen. To one side, a low wall of brick separated the front garden from a side path, and that path ran down toward a small outbuilding where the coal was kept, and where a second door opened into the kitchens at the rear of the house. Inside this quiet building, in the year 1896, lived a man named Henry Smith. He was 79 years of age. He had been a retired engineer for many years, and before that he had been a working engineer for many more, in the years when the great railways and bridges and waterworks and pumping stations of the kingdom were rising one after another, and when men of his trade were thought as well of in their own way as men of the older professions. He'd made his fortune in the modest and careful way of that older school of engineering, by long hours and careful accounts and a long memory for the failures of other men's bolts, and he had kept his fortune by the same means by which he had made it. He was a widower. His wife had died some years before, and he had not remarried, and there were no children living with him in the house. He kept no companion. He kept no dog, although it was said that he had once kept a great black retriever, long since dead, whose painted portrait hung still in the parlour. He kept only himself, and the rooms he moved through, and the small daily rounds he had made for so long now, that they had taken on the soft worn look of habit and the still feel of ritual. He rose early, the gardener would later say, even in the dark months of the year, when the lane outside was still under the lamps and the windows showed no light. He took his breakfast alone at a small table in the dining room, with the morning paper folded neatly beside his plate, and he ate the same modest food day after day. A slice of bread, a curl of butter, a soft-boiled egg with a silver spoon laid beside it, a pot of tea kept warm beneath a knitted cosy that his late wife had stitched for him long ago. He read the news of the city and of the markets in which he had once worked, turning the pages slowly, with old hands marked by the faint blue veins of his age. He did not speak to anyone for hours together. Sometimes, in the milder hours of the afternoon, he went out, walking down the lane to the high street with a stick under his arm, and his hat tipped to those whom he passed, and made a small purchase at the chemist, or stood for a few minutes at the iron railings of St. James's to look at the church, or read the printed notices upon the parish board. Mostly, he did not go out at all. He sat by the fire. He read his book. He kept his own company. The hours passed slowly within the walls of Muswell Lodge. The neighbourhood, in its kindly and curious way, had built around him a reputation that was perhaps not quite fair to the man himself, and yet was not without some truth in it either. He was thought to be a miser. The word ran softly in the quiet houses up and down Tetherdown that the old gentleman in the lodge kept great sums of money about him in his rooms, that he did not trust the banks of the city as he ought to trust them, that he lived more poorly than he could afford to live, that he had silver hidden away in cupboards and gold hidden away in drawers, and bonds sealed up in tin boxes beneath the floor. Some of this talk was the ordinary talk of suburbs, when neighbours invent for one another the lives they cannot see. Some of it was closer to the truth than the tellers of it knew. Mr. Smith did keep cash in the house. He kept it in a strong safe in his bedroom, set against the wall between the bed and the window. He kept it there because, in his long working life, he had grown to trust the iron of a strong box more than the paper of a clerk, and because he was a careful man by nature, and because the years had made him more careful, not less. And he was, above all, a man who knew that the suburb was not safe. He knew it because he read the papers every morning and saw the reports of burglary that came in from the daughter towns ringing the city. He knew it because he had heard, year by year, of houses broken open up and down the northern hills, of plate carried off in the night, of bureaus turned upside down in the dark while the family slept upstairs and heard nothing. He knew it most of all because his own house stood at the very edge of the built world, with the ancient dark wall of coldfall wood pressed against the back of his garden, and a hedge between his lane and the open fields beyond. So he had set about, in his own engineer's way, the making of his own defences, with the steady, patient pleasure of a man who had spent his working life fitting one mechanical thing into another. He had not asked for a constable to call more often. He had not put his trust in the parish watch. He had trusted instead the work of his own hands, and he had built around himself a small and careful system of iron and string and powder and spring that he believed could hold the night out. The shutters of Muswell Lodge were thick and heavy, made of a hard, close-grained wood, and they closed across the inside of every window after dark, and were fastened with iron bars that ran from one side of the frame to the other and dropped into iron sockets at each end. The front door had a great bolt above the lock and a chain below it, and there was a second key for the inner panel and a third small bolt that slid sideways into the door jamb at the height of the master's hand. The back door had a bolt at the top and a bolt at the bottom and a chain between them. The windows of the ground floor were further fitted with small iron rods that dropped into sockets in the sill, so that even a broken pane of glass could not let a hand through far enough to reach the latch within. Every keyhole was covered at night by a small brass plate that slid across upon a screw. Every window catch had a turning key of its own that the master kept upon a ring at his waist by day and laid upon his bedside table by night, and these were only the inner defences. In the back garden, which sloped down toward the wood between two lines of pruned fruit trees, the old engineer had set what he called his alarm. A length of fine wire was strung at a man's ankle height between two thin iron posts that had been driven into the soft ground just inside the boundary at the lower end of the lawn, where any man climbing over the back fence from the wood would have no choice but to set his foot. Where the wire ended, on the side nearer the house, it ran through a small iron loop and was tied to the trigger of a fowling piece, a long-barrelled gun of an older pattern, much like the guns that gamekeepers had carried in his youth, that lay on its side in a small wooden box bolted to a third post. The gun was loaded with powder and with a charge of small shot. If the wire were touched in the night, the trigger would pull, and the gun would fire, and the report of it, carried up the long slope on the still night air, would wake the master of the house in his bedroom upstairs, and would wake the gardener and his wife in their cottage by the kitchen yard, and would carry far enough besides to bring a constable up from the High Street, if a constable up from the High Street, if a constable up from the High Street, if a constable happened to be passing along it. It was a clever piece of work. It was the kind of thing an engineer of the older school would build, with the same care he had once spent on a railway signal, or a colliery winding gear, or a small steam pump for a country house. It had been tested. It had been reset. It was, in the master's mind, his safest and quietest friend. There were other small devices about the house as well, smaller and less serious in their making, but still each one carefully thought out, each one fitted by the master's own hand, each one tried and adjusted and tried again. A wooden rattle that fell from its place on a shelf if a certain interior door was forced. A small bell that hung from a string above the back stairs, and would ring softly if the kitchen door swung in from outside. A length of cord above the cellar window that, if disturbed, would tip a small lead weight onto the slates of the scullery roof. A detonator of the sort used at quarries had once been fixed near the cellar window, but it had been removed some time before after a difficulty with the powder, and now lay disconnected in a drawer of the writing desk in the parlour. Each of these things had been thought about, fitted, and tried by Mr. Smith himself, with his old engineer's pleasure in a careful joint and a true spring, and the satisfying click of a well-set catch. He went round them himself last thing at night, by the light of a candle in a brass holder, before he climbed the stairs to bed. He set the wire. He bolted the shutters. He drew the chain. He turned the key. He listened. Then he went up. The inside of the lodge, after these labours of the evening were done, was a small warm world quite shut off from the lane and the wood, and the wider darkness beyond it. A coal fire burned low in the parlour grate behind a polished brass fender. The clock on the mantel ticked. The hall, lit by a single brass oil lamp turned down for the night, smelled of beeswax polish under the particular dust of old wool carpets long laid against the floorboards. On a small table in the hall there stood a tray for visiting cards, and very few visiting cards were laid upon it in any given week. A walking stick of polished oak leaned in one corner. A heavy overcoat hung from a peg, smelling faintly of camphor. The stairs were wide and not steep, with a runner of dark red Brussels carpet held down by brass rods at the back of each tread. The banister was of mahogany, dark and warm to the hand, polished by 70 years of the same palm running up, and the same palm running down. Upstairs, the master's bedroom looked out across the front garden and the quiet lane. It was a square room with a high ceiling, papered in a quiet pattern of grey and pale rose, with a small fireplace of plain marble and a low fender of polished steel. A four-poster bed of dark wood stood against one wall, with curtains of heavy green damask tied back at the corners by silken cords. A washstand stood beside it, with a china jug and basin painted in a pattern of small blue flowers and a small oval mirror above. At the foot of the bed there stood a large wooden chest, plain and dark and brass-bound, and beside it, against the wall between the bed and the window, stood the safe. The safe was a tall and heavy thing of green painted iron, made by one of the good London makers, with a brass handle and a keyhole in the centre, and a combination dial above. Inside it were ledgers and bonds, and a number of small canvas bags, and a quantity of gold sovereigns folded into rolls of paper. The room kept its own quiet. The clock in the hall below ticked through the boards. The wind in the chimney rose and fell. The shutters were drawn each night by the master himself, and barred from within. In this room, on the long winter nights of February and the year 1896, Mr. Henry Smith slept the same sleep he had slept for many years, in a bed that was warm with a stone-hot water bottle wrapped in flannel, beneath blankets that smelled of cedar wood, with the same small leather-bound book of evening prayers laid open on the table beside him, as had been laid there every night of his widowhood. The fire in the parlour had gone out hours before. The shutters were fast. The bolts were drawn. The wire in the garden was set. The fowling-piece in its small wooden box was loaded. The brass plate covered the keyhole of the front door. The clock ticked. The frost gathered on the window glass in slow, fine ferns. The candle on the bedside table burned down to its last half-inch, and was extinguished by the master's own breath before he laid his old head upon the pillow. The house had been made as safe as any one man could make it. The hill was still. The wood was still. And the night, with all its long, patient hours, gathered itself in the lane outside. Chapter 3. The Old Wood and the New Streets. To know the lodge properly, one had also to know the wood, because the wood was the great fact of that whole western side of the hill, the dark face that looked in upon the back of every garden along Tetherdown, the silent boundary against which the new brick suburbs of late Victorian London had pressed and stopped. Coltful Wood was older than any of the buildings that stood near it, older than the road that passed its eastern edge, older than the parish of Hornsey, older than the name of England itself in its present form. Its oaks had been growing in their places when the first wooden church of St. James was raised, and they had been growing still when that church was pulled down and a stone one built upon its foundations, and they had gone on growing through the wars of the Stuart kings and the long peace of the Georgian ones, dropping their leaves and their acorns winter by winter, lifting them again summer by summer, untouched by the great changing of the country around them. The ground beneath them was thick with leaf mould a foot deep in places, and beneath that lay rough stones brought down by the ice in a far older winter, and beneath those lay the heavy yellow clay, and beneath the clay the bones of older creatures still, the long-forgotten beasts of the world before man. In the daylight, the wood was a place that men knew, and that the people of the parish had known for many lifetimes. The boys of the suburb came in with sticks under their arms to play at soldiers among the ferns, and the children of the new villas wandered along its narrow paths in the company of nursemaids, and the gardeners of the larger houses came in to take a small bundle of dead wood, when the parish would not feel it. In the autumn, the men of the parish came in to gather what acorns the squirrels had not taken, and to mark the boundary which was kept, even now, by an old earth-bank with a ditch on its outer side, the very same earth-bank that monks of an older century had thrown up to keep their pigs in. The keepers of the cemetery of St. Pancras in Islington, which lay along the wood's western side, sometimes walked the paths to make sure the boundary was kept. A coppicer's hand had worked these oaks for many lifetimes. The wood was an ordinary wood by day. There were ordinary people in it. The smoke of a small fire might rise above the trees in the afternoon, where a charcoal burner was at his slow, careful work. A horse might be seen tethered to a low branch at the edge, while its owner gathered something within. A dog might bark and be answered by another dog, and the bark be lost among the trunks. But the wood at night was a different country altogether, as every man and woman on Tetherdown knew without saying it. The paths into it were not lit. The keepers did not walk in it after dark. The boys of the suburb were called home long before the light had quite gone off the canopy. After dark, The wood became a wide and silent body of trees, with the lamps of the new streets glowing only faintly through the trunks at its edges, and the deep middle of it filled with a darkness that the eye could not enter at all. Foxes moved in it. Owls called across it. Sometimes, in the colder months, a deer broke out of the southern end of the wood and came down across a back garden before slipping away again into the next stretch of trees. But men did not enter it at night, and no one expected them to, and no one watched its paths for anyone who might be passing along them in the dark. The wood was a wall. The wall was untended. The wall stood at the back fence of Muswell Lodge. The lane called Tetherdown ran along the eastern edge of this wood, separated from it by a thin row of houses on its western side. The lane had once been a country track called Tatterdown Lane, the name preserved in the spelling of older parish maps, and it had skirted the eastern edge of an open common that stretched away westward toward Coldfall and East Finchley in the days before the new building. The common was mostly gone now. It had been broken up, sold off, built upon, fenced in, but the lane was still recognisably the old lane, narrower than the streets it joined at either end, less straight than them, with hedges that bulged where they had bulged for centuries, and turnings that followed older field boundaries no man could now name. There were 8 or 10 large detached houses along its length in the year 1896, each set well apart from its neighbours, each with its own gate and its own gravel and its own walled garden. Stanley Lodge stood almost directly opposite Muswell Lodge, on the eastern side of the lane. It had been built to be a public house, but it had never opened as one, and it was lived in instead as a private residence, with an old sign bracket still set into the wall above the front door for the sign that had never hung from it. The other houses had names of their own, names painted neatly on iron gates or carved into stone gate posts, and the families inside them kept to themselves in the manner of the suburb, knowing one another only by sight, by carriage, by the small movements of daily life along the path between gate and porch. In a small cottage tucked into the grounds of Muswell Lodge itself, set a little way from the main house and screened from it by a hedge of holly, there lived the gardener and his wife. His name was Charles Webber. He was a man of middle years, plain in his dress and quiet in his manners, of the careful and respectable working class that had built the New England around them, and that knew very well where it stood in the long order of things. He had worked for Mr. Smith for some good time, and he knew the master's habits and the master's preferences with the close patient knowledge of a man who lived within sight of the house every day. He knew the comings and the goings of the post and the carriage. He knew the preferences for one bed of vegetables over another, the particular orders concerning the apple tree at the corner of the lawn, the way the master liked the gravel raked in long straight lines from the gate. He kept the gravel raked. He kept the laurels trimmed. He kept the lawn cut in the long days of summer with a heavy iron mower that he pushed himself, leaning his weight upon the handle as the blades turned and the cut grass fell behind him in a green ridge. He kept the leaves swept in the autumn into great mounds at the corner of the garden, where they were burned in slow smoky heaps that the boys of the neighbourhood gathered to watch. He kept the paths clear of snow in the winter with a wooden shovel that he had owned for many years and that he had wound about the handle with a piece of leather to save his palms. He was, in the very particular and limited sense of the word, the manager of the small estate. He was also, in another sense, the keeper of the master's safety, for it was Charles Webber who set the tripwire each night at the bottom of the garden, just as the dusk thickened into proper dark. The wire ran between 2 thin iron posts that he had himself driven into the ground at the lower end of the law, where the slope began to fall away toward the wooden fence, and the master had shown him, year by year, the precise tension at which the trigger of the fowling piece in its small wooden box would draw, and the precise height above the soil at which the wire ought to lie if a man climbing over the fence at the bottom were to catch it with the toe of his boot. The gardener went down to the foot of the garden each evening before dusk, lifted the box lid, checked the loading, lowered the lid, tied the wire to its loop, drew it across the boundary, and tied it off to the other post. He tested the tautness with a careful finger. He left it. He came back up the path through the long shadows of the laurels. He shut the small iron gate at the kitchen step. He spoke a word or two to his wife inside the cottage. He took his supper at the small kitchen table by the fire. He went to bed when the master's lamp went out across the lawn. He did all of these things in the same order on every evening of the year. Habit had made them invisible to him. The work of keeping a man safe had become only a thing he did before his own supper, like washing his hands at the basin, or hanging his cap on the peg. The household around the gardener was very small. There was his wife, a plain, quiet woman of his own years, who kept the cottage clean and did the cooking for the two of them, and sometimes did mending for the master when his old shirts had begun to fray at the cuff. There was, by day, a charwoman from the High Street who came in twice a week to help with the heavier work of the main house and to scour the kitchen flags. There was, at certain hours, the boy from the chandler's who brought up the candles and the oil in a covered basket. There was the milkman in the early morning with his churn upon a small cart, drawn by a sturdy little pony with bells on its harness, who left a pail of milk at the kitchen door and called a greeting through the half-open hatch. There was the baker's man with bread 2 mornings in the week. There was the butcher's boy on Saturdays with the joint for the Sunday table, carrying it in a small wooden tray covered with a white cloth. There was the postman, in his grey uniform with red piping, twice in the day at his appointed hours, his leather bag worn shiny across the shoulder. There was, very rarely, the doctor, called up the lane in his closed brougham, only when the master felt a chill or a turn of the gout. Otherwise the lodge received no callers. The gate bell did not ring. The brass knocker on the front door was struck only by tradesmen, and by the postman, and by the long, slow passage of the wind. The rhythm of the household, then, was the rhythm of a clock that wound itself. In the morning the gardener stirred the fires in the master's house, and the milkman came up the lane with a soft clink of his pail, and the master rose and took his breakfast and read his paper. In the long middle hours of the day the gardener worked outside if the weather allowed it, kneeling in the beds or trimming at the laurels with a pair of long shears, and the master sat by his fire in the parlour, and the wife of the gardener cleaned the cottage and put a stew upon the hob, and the parish carts rumbled past on tether down bearing coal and beer and timber to the houses farther up the lane. In the afternoon the post came up the path, and a letter or two was brought across to the master, and he answered them in his own small old hand at the writing desk in the parlour. In the early evening the lamplighter came along the lane with his long pole and his small ladder, and one by one the gas lamps of Tetherdown began to glow, each lamp like a small soft moon at its iron post. The gardener went down to the wire. The shutters of the lodge went up. The bolts went home. The chain went into its socket. The lights in the cottage went out, and the lights in the main house went out, and the lane returned to its winter darkness. That winter, which was the winter of 1895 into 96, had been a cold one across the whole of the south of England, and the people of the hill had felt it more than most, because the hill was higher and the wind was sharper. The frosts had come early and stayed late. The ponds upon the common were skinned with ice from the first week of December onward. The leaves of the laurels in the garden of Muswell Lodge were stiff each morning and had to be brushed clear of rime before the gardener could rake the gravel beneath them. The water in the rain butt by the kitchen door was frozen solid for days together and had to be broken with the back of a hatchet before a pail could be lowered through. The chimneys of every house on Tetherdown smoked all day long, and the air above the slope was hazed with the smell of burning coal. The lamplighter came earlier each afternoon as the day shortened, and went his round later each morning as the days began at last to lengthen again. The wood in its deep middle was full of the small dry sounds of frost. The splitting of a twig, the falling of a fragment of bark, the brittle cracking of a leaf when a fox set its foot upon it. The wind that blew across the slope from the open fields beyond carried the smell of cold earth and cold smoke and nothing else. Sometimes, very late at night, a barn owl crossed the gardens of the lane on silent wings, white as a moth in the lamplight, and was gone before any sleeper could be sure it had passed. By the second week of February, the worst of the winter was thought to be passing. The shopkeepers of the High Street said so at their counters, in the small quiet way they had of speaking to one another. The vicar of St. James's said so in his sermon on a quiet Sunday morning, lifting his eyes from his notes for a moment, to mention the hopeful signs in the hedgerows. The newspapers reported a milder spell expected by the end of the month, and printed columns about the early crocuses upon the heath, but on the nights themselves that mildness had not yet come. The frost gathered as it had gathered. The lamps glowed in their iron standards along the lane. The shutters of Muswell Lodge closed against the dusk. The wire at the bottom of the garden was set. The fowling piece in its small box was loaded with the same care as it had been loaded every other night of that winter. The gardener Charles Weather crossed the gravel to his cottage and put out his lamp, and the dark country of Coldfall Wood, in which no man walked at night, stood waiting at the foot of the lawn as it had waited for centuries. The candle in the master's bedroom burned itself out. The clock in the hall ticked through the silent boards. The lane lay quiet beneath its line of lamps. The fox moved once in the wood and did not move again. The night, as the night had done for every night of that winter, settled down upon the slope. The frost gathered upon the iron railings. The wood was still. The lane was still. And the small dark world of Muswell Lodge slept on, as it had slept for many years, and as it slept that night. Chapter 4. The underside of the gaslight. Far on the other side of London from the quiet wood of Muswell Hill, on the western edge of the great city where the railway lines ran out toward Willesden and the open country beyond, there lay a different sort of world altogether. It was the same London, lit by the same gas, ruled by the same queen, walked by the same constables in the same tall helmets. But it was the side of the city that did not show in the picture books or the catalogues of the great department stores. It was the London of the half-built brick streets behind the railway lines, of the long terraces of small flat-faced houses thrown up by the speculator 40 years before and already running down at the heels, of the workshops and the rag shops and the small steaming laundries and the courts behind the public houses where the gas jets burned all day, because the daylight never properly reached down between the walls. It was the London of the cabman's shelter at the corner of the rank and the costermonger's barrow under the railway arch, and the boys who sold matches and bootlaces in the dusk. It was the London of the working poor, and, beneath the working poor, of the people who had fallen through the working poor into something else again, into the soft floor of the city that had no name. In the parish of Kensalltown, the streets ran in long parallel lines northward from the great cut of the Grand Union Canal, between the high black wall of the gasworks on one hand, and the long quiet acres of Kensal Green burial ground on the other. A little further west, beyond the canal again, lay Nossing Dale, where the brickfields had been worked out, and the pig-keepers had been driven out, and a great quarter of small two-roomed houses had taken their place, packed in tight together with passages between them that scarcely allowed two men to walk abreast. A little to the east of Kensal lay Kilburn, with its mixed character of small lodging-houses and beer-shops along the high road, and its respectable villas higher up the hill, and its back streets where the rents were lower than the front, and where the people who lived in those back streets did not always give their right names when asked. The streets of all these places had names that were respectable enough in their lettering: Southam Street, Bonchurch Road, Adair Road, Walmer Road, Telford Road, Latimer Road, but the houses upon them held lives that the maps could not record and that the rate books had to guess at. By night, the gas lamps stood far apart in these streets, as they did in the suburbs to the north. But the light they gave seemed thinner and dirtier somehow, blurred by the constant smoke of the gasworks, and the brick kilns, and the small home fires of so many close-packed rooms. The pavement under the lamps was slick with damp. The fronts of the houses were dark, except for a single window here and there where a woman bent over needlework by the light of a paraffin lamp, or a child sat reading at a table, because the family kitchen was too full for him to be elsewhere. The public houses glowed at the corners. The doors of the public houses swung in and out, releasing a wave of warm smoky air and the smell of beer and the sound of voices and the sudden flash of bright gaslight, and then closing again into the dim street. Cabs went past at long intervals, their lamps swaying gently as the horse stepped over the wet cobbles. A constable in his tall helmet walked his beat slowly along the curb, his cape over his shoulder, his lantern dark by his side, his boots ringing with that particular slow, steady sound which was a comfort to some and a warning to others. A boy ran across a court behind the cab. A door opened and shut. A woman called a name once from an upstairs window and got no answer. The night went on with its quiet, ordinary business. In 1,000 small rooms behind those fronts, men of a certain class lived the kind of life that did not appear in any honest ledger. They worked when work was to be had, on the canals and the markets and the building sites of West London, but the work was not steady, and the wages was small, and there were always more hands than there were jobs. So they took on other work besides. They watched a house when a friend asked them to watch a house. They carried a parcel from one place to another and asked no question of what was inside it. They knew where a tool might be borrowed and not returned. They knew where a watch might be sold and no question asked of where it had come from. They knew the names of fences in Stepney and the names of pawnbrokers in the borough who did not look too long at a hallmark. They knew the times of the late trains out of Marylebone and Euston. They knew the back gates of the rich suburbs to the north, and the patterns of the lights in the windows of the houses along the better streets. They had spent, many of them, some part of their lives within the cold granite walls of Dartmoor, or the brick galleries of Portland, or the corridors of Pentonville, and they had come out again, ticket of leave men with the parchment of their licence folded into an inside pocket, and they had gone back to the only trade they truly knew, because the trade they knew was the trade they knew was the trade they knew. Among them, in the late winter of 1896, were two men whose names will pass briefly through this story without weight or honour. The elder of them, who was the smaller and the slighter, kept a small house in a street called Southam Street, a thin terrace running north from the gasworks, where he lived with his wife and her young brother and the various lodgers and visitors that came and went through the parlour of such houses. He was a man in his early 30s. He worked, on and off, as a labourer. He had small hands and a thin face and a sideways way of looking at any man who spoke to him. The younger of the two, who was the heavier and the stronger, lodged in another street not far away, and had spent the worst part of his 30 years in the great granite prison upon Dartmoor for an earlier piece of breaking and entering, and had come out the year before on the same ticket of leave as 1,000 other men. He had not done well since. The two of them had fallen in together in the manner of such men in such streets, drinking in the same houses, drifting through the same days, sharing the same rumours of what might be had and where it might be had from. They are best left in this telling as shadows. The history of the period gives them their names, Milson and Fowler, and the columns of the newspapers of the year would soon enough fill themselves with both of those names, more fully than either deserved to be filled. That the truer subject of this chapter is not the two men themselves. It is the world out of which they came, the long unlit terraces, the half-empty public houses, the lodging-house parlours with the smell of cabbage and pipe tobacco, the broken paving in the courts, the ladies' charities that came once a month to leave a tract and a shilling, the relieving officer who came once a wink to enter a name in a book, the slow rolling stones of the great machinery of the Poor Law and the Prison Commission, and the Metropolitan Police that ground these lives along them, as it had crown out of the out and out, out. The era made the trade. The trade made the men. The men were not the story. The era was. The trade itself was an old one. It had been carried on, in one form or another, since London had grown large enough to have rich houses and poor neighbours, and it had its tools and its rules like any other trade in the kingdom. A burglar of the year 1896 carried, in the deep inside pocket of his coat, a short iron jemmy for the prizing open of windows and doors. He carried a small dark lantern with a sliding shutter that could be closed against the light when he stood still in a yard. He carried a length of fine wire, or a bent skeleton key, or a small steel pick for the working of locks of the simpler kinds. He carried, if he was wiser than most, no name and no paper that could later be used against him in a court. He went out, often on a winter evening, when the dark came early and the streets emptied early and the householders kept indoors over their fires. He went often by train, taking a ticket only as far as he needed to go, walking the rest on foot through quiet lanes. He went often in pairs because two men could lift between them what one man alone could not, and because one could watch while the other worked, and because one could give the warning if the other did not see the constable turn the corner of the street. He came back when he came back, by the same trains in the early hours of the morning, with whatever he had carried out about his person folded into the lining of his coat, and he took it later that day to a man in a back room behind a shop, and he sold it for a fraction of its worth, and he drank a part of his share by the next nightfall in the same public house at which he had drunk the nightfall, in the same public house at which he had drunk the night before. The fences of West London, the small shopkeepers who took stolen goods, broke up the silver, melted the gold, and sold the parts on quietly into the long supply chain of dishonest commerce, were as much a fixture of the streets as the chandlers or the bakers or the small chemists with their coloured bottles in the window. They lived behind the front rooms of pawn shops, or in the back of a clockmender's, or in the small, dark interior of a watch-glass shop, with a single bell upon the door. They asked few questions. They gave fewer answers. They paid less than half the worth of a thing on the day it was brought in, and they did not deal twice with a man who was foolish. They were the still point of the trade. Without them, the burglar would have had nothing to do with what he carried away from the houses of the rich. Because of them, he could work, and because he could work, the trade went on, and the houses of the suburbs were watched in the dark by eyes the householders did not see. and in the great long public houses of the Kilburn High Road, where the gas jets hung in their pierced brass rosettes and the long counters of dark mahogany ran down the length of the bar, and the floors were strewn fresh each morning with clean yellow sawdust, men of this trade met one another and traded news without seeming to. A nod, a half-spoken sentence, the lifting of a glass, a name was given. A street was mentioned. A house was described. A back gate. A weak window. A master who kept money in the house and lived alone. Sometimes the description was a rumour, and sometimes it was true, and sometimes it was both at once. Sometimes it was an old man at the edge of the suburbs, at the back of an old wood, in a house called by such and such a name, on a lane called by such and such a name. Sometimes the two men listening at the corner of the bar did not say a word at all in reply, but only finished their glasses and went out together into the night and turned at the corner toward the railway line. Sometimes the taproom emptied itself slowly, and the gas jets were turned down by the landlord at the appointed hour, and the night went on as before. It was such a night, in the second week of February, in the year 1896, that the two shadows of this chapter at last set out together from a small house in Southam Street. They carried with them a small toy lantern of tin, the kind that could be bought for fourpence at any chandler's in the city, fitted with a stub of common candle, and lifted from the dresser of the kitchen, where it had belonged to the younger brother of the elder man's wife. They carried a short iron jemmy. They carried a piece of bent wire. They wore dark coats with deep inside pockets. They drank one drink and then another at a public house in Kilburn, where they spoke briefly with 2 or 3 other men whom they knew, and asked once or twice the easiest way to a station from which a train ran north toward Muswell Hill. Then they left the public house. The door swung shut behind them. The gas jets within glowed yellow on after they had gone. The fog beyond the door was thick. They turned their collars up. They walked out of the picture for a moment, leaving the warmth of the room behind them, and the night took them in. The hour was late. The city sighed in its sleep. And somewhere far across that sleeping city, beyond the railway lines, beyond the lit streets, beyond the gardens and the gates and the laurels of the northern suburbs, the long February night gathered itself upon a slope above a brook called the Moselle. The lamps along Tetherdown burned low in their iron standards. The wood at the foot of the lawn stood still. The frost deepened upon the iron railings. The candle burned low, and the city, vast and gaslit and unaware of itself, turned gently upon its bed and was silent. Chapter 5. The night of the 13th. The 13th of February in 1896 fell upon a Thursday, and the day itself had been one of those grey, unmoving February days when the sun does not so much rise as merely thin the dark, and the cold lies upon the streets without wind, and the smoke of the chimneys does not lift from the slate roofs but hangs at the level of the upper windows in long flat ribbons. Across the whole of London the day passed in its ordinary manner, with nothing in it to mark it out from any other day of that long winter. The city clerks went to their desks at 9 and took up their pens and dipped them in their inkwells. The market porters carried their heavy loads upon their shoulders down the cobbled lanes of Smithfield and Billingsgate. The schoolmistresses kept their classrooms warm with small coal stoves and listened to the times tables being chanted by rows of small thin voices. The newspaper boys sold their papers at the corners and shouted the headlines into the cold. The horses of the omnibuses steamed at every standing place, with their breath rising in white clouds about their bridles, and the gas lamps along the long western terraces of Kensal and Nottingdale and Kilburn came on early in the afternoon, because the daylight, such as it had been, was already going thin and grey by 3 o'clock. It was a day like any other day in the long tale of that winter. It made no claim upon the memory of anyone who passed through it. The few who would later remember it, and there would be many of those, before another year had run its course, would remember it only as the day before. By 6 o'clock in the evening the cold had set hard upon the streets. The pavements of the western parishes shone faintly under the lamps, with the first thin glaze of frost that would deepen as the night ran on. The shop windows along Kilburn High Road were lit behind their pulled-down half-blinds, and the doors of the public houses had begun their long swing of the working evening, opening and closing, releasing each time a small breath of warmer air into the cold of the street, and drawing each time another working man in from the dark. Within the public houses the gas jets burned bright above the long mahogany counters, and the men who came in stamped their boots upon the strewn yellow sawdust at the door, and shrugged their coats off their shoulders, and put their elbows upon the wood of the counter, and took their first drink in silence, while the warmth began to come back into their stiff red hands. The hour was the hour of the working man's small pleasure. The hour was also the hour of the men who did not work, or who worked but seldom, and who came in for other reasons. Among the figures who passed through the long door of one such public house in Kilburn that evening were the two whose journey is the subject of this chapter. And yet the two of them are not the proper centre of the picture, and shall not be made so here. They were two men in dark winter coats and soft hats pulled down a little against the wind. They drank one drink and then another. They spoke briefly with 3 or 4 other men whom they knew, leaning their heads close together over the counter, and speaking in voices that did not carry. They asked, in the easy, idle way men ask such things, the best route from the high road to a station from which a train ran north toward Muswell Hill. The answer was given to them. They thanked the man who gave it. They finished their glasses. They moved toward the door. The bell of the door rang faintly as they passed beneath it. The fog of the street swallowed them. The gas jets within glowed yellow on after they had gone, and the conversation of the room closed back over the space where they had stood, as a still pond closes over a thrown stone. The station to which they walked stood at the end of a quiet street that ran down from the high road, beneath the lattice of telegraph wires and the smoke-stained glass canopy of its modest platform. It was one of the smaller stations of the railway companies that crossed and recrossed the northern suburbs in those years, when 6 different lines competed for the trade of the new districts, and when a man might travel from one part of London to another by a route that took him through stations he had never seen before in his life. The booking clerk inside the small wooden ticket office sat behind a brass grill with a green-shaded lamp upon his desk, and a half-eaten piece of bread and cheese on a square of newspaper beside it. The 2 men bought 2 third-class tickets to a station nearer to Muswell Hill. They paid with small silver from a coat pocket. The clerk pushed the tickets across the grill and a few coins of change with them, and went back to his ledger without lifting his eyes. They passed on to the platform. The platform was almost empty at that hour. There was only an old porter in a long blue coat, moving along the painted wooden boards with his lantern, and one woman with a market basket sitting upon a bench at the far end of the platform, and a clerk in a black overcoat reading his evening paper, folded into a long narrow strip. The lamps of the platform hissed gently above their iron standards. The cold air smelled of soot and of metal and of the particular old wood of railway stations, that smell of pine planks long soaked in the smoke of 40 years of trains. The 2 men stood a little apart from one another. They did not speak to each other. They held their hands deep in their coat pockets. The minute hand of the platform clock moved slowly around the face of the white enamelled dial, with a small audible click at each minute. A signal bell rang somewhere down the line. A goods train passed on the further track without stopping, drawing a long line of laden wagons behind it, the brakes squealing faintly into the dark. The passenger train came in out of the dark a few minutes later. It announced itself first as a low rumble in the rails beneath the platform, then as a brightening at the curve of the line, then as a heavy huff of steam. And then it was beside them, with the great brass-edged front lamp of the engine shining and the white plume of its breath rolling away into the lamps of the station. The doors of the third-class carriages swung open along the length of the train. The porter walked beside the train with his lantern. The 2 men stepped up into a carriage that was nearly empty, and they sat opposite one another on the dark cushioned bench seats, and they folded their hands upon their knees, and they looked at the floor between them. The whistle blew at the head of the train. The doors slammed shut along its length. The engine took the load. The platform began to slick away from the window. The lamps of Kilburn moved slowly past, and then the lamps of the streets behind Kilburn, and then there were dark spaces of allotments, and of railway cuttings, and of long lines of small lit windows in unknown houses, and the train carried them away to the north. The third-class carriage was cold and unheated, as third-class carriages always were upon the railways of that time. The wooden walls of the compartment knocked and creaked with the running of the wheels. The single oil lamp set into the ceiling shed only a thin yellow light, hardly more than the light of a single candle, and the corners of the compartment lay in shadow. The window glass was steamed at the edges with the breath of the few passengers in the train, and it was clear in the middle, where one of them had rubbed it with the sleeve of his coat. Through that clear patch the dark country of North London passed by, frame after frame, like the pictures of one of the new magic lantern shows that the children of the suburbs were taken to see on rainy afternoons. A row of small back gardens with their washing lines empty in the cold. A factory with its high black chimney smoking still against the orange sky. A long line of railway sidings with goods wagons standing in them under blue lamps. A cricket field, locked up and empty for the winter. A row of new villas with curtains drawn behind lit windows. The clatter of the wheels through a long brick cutting. The sudden ringing echo of an iron bridge. And then the open dark again. The train slowed at a station and stood for a moment with the platform lamps bright at the doors, and a porter calling out the name of the place into the cold, and then it moved on. At a station near the top of the Great Northern Slope, the two men got out. They were not the only passengers to alight there. A small group of travellers in better coats passed before them along the platform, men returning home to their suppers from the city, with their evening papers folded under their arms, and their breath rising white in the lamplight. Men whose names were upon the rate books of the new suburbs and whose houses had been waited for upstairs by wives and by the smell of warm food. The two men in the darker coats let these others pass ahead. They handed in their tickets at the gate. They came out into the street beyond. The street was a quiet one with shops shut and shutters down, and the gas lamps standing far apart in their tall iron standards, and the brass of a single brass shop sign reflecting a faint yellow line where the lamplight caught it. They began to walk. The walk to the edge of Muswell Hill from that station was not a long walk for a man on a clear night, but on a thick February night, beneath a sky that gave no moon and that held its fog low in every dip of the road, it took the two men nearly an hour. They walked first along a wide high street where the public houses were still lit, and the few passers-by were the people of the suburb out on small late errands. A maid sent for a bottle of port, a clerk coming home from his late train, a constable on his beat with his hands clasped behind his back beneath his cape. They turned out of the high street into a quieter road. They walked beneath the bare branches of plane trees that had been planted by the parish 10 years before, and that arched above their heads like the dark vaults of a tunnel. They passed the iron gates of villas whose names they did not stop to read. They crossed a small stone bridge over a brook that ran beneath them in the cold, the water of it hissing faintly between its frozen banks. They came at last into the long quiet lane called Tetherdown. They did not enter the lane itself, because the lane was watched by its own line of lamps. They kept instead to the dark path that ran along its western edge, between the back hedges of the villas on one hand and the open boundary of the wood on the other. That path took them down at last to the lower edge of Coldfall Wood. The wood at this hour was as dark as the wood had ever been. The few lamps of Tetherdown gleamed faintly through the bare trunks at its eastern edge, like small distant fires across a wide river. The middle of the wood was a wall of black that the eye could not pass into. The two men stood for a moment at the boundary. They listened. There was the small dry creaking of the frosted branches above them. There was the very faint distant sound of a goods train upon the line below the hill. There was, far off across the silent suburb, the bark of a single dog, answered by no other. They lifted the lid of the small toy lantern of tin that the elder of them carried, and they struck a wax match against the rough side of its box. A soft hiss of the head as it caught, the flare of the wax, the small steady yellow that came from the stub of common candle within. And they slid the small tin shutter half closed against the light, and they stepped into the wood between two oaks whose trunks were older than any street in the suburb behind them. The wood received them silently. Their boots crunched once or twice upon the frosted leaves at the edge, and then found softer ground beneath, where the leaf mould muffled the step. The candle in the lantern gave them only enough light to see the next 10 paces, a faint yellow circle that moved with them along the path, and that lit the lower branches of the oaks above their heads in slow-passing washes of gold. The wood smelled of cold earth and of leaf mould and of the very faint sweetness of fallen oak. The trunks of the great trees stood up around them on every side, going up into a darkness through which only here and there a fragment of dim sky could be seen. The breath rose white before them and was lost upward in the dark. A small night creature, perhaps a fox, moved off to one side at the sound of their coming, and was gone before it had been quite seen. They walked slowly along the inside of the eastern boundary of the wood, keeping the line of the old earth bank to their right hand, because that was the line that would bring them, after some quiet minutes, to the foot of the long sloping back garden of Muswell Lodge. They did not speak. The elder of them carried the lantern. The younger of them, who walked half a pace behind, carried a short iron bar in the inside pocket of his coat and a piece of fine wire and a bent steel pick. Neither of them carried any paper that bore his name. Neither carried any small object that would have told a stranger who he was. They were, for the length of that passage through the wood, only two figures with a small moving light, and the light slid along the dark line of the trunks, and the trunks gave back no answer. At last the bank rose a little upon their right hand, and at the top of it there ran a low wooden fence, and beyond the wooden fence there was the lower edge of the long lawn that ran up the slope toward the dark house at the head of it. The two men stopped. They closed the slide of the lantern against the light, so that only a thin sliver of yellow showed at the seam. They waited, listening. The fence had no creaking. The lawn beyond it was a faint paler grey under its frost. The house at the head of the lawn showed no blow at any of its windows. Far above the dark roof line of the house, the tall chimney stood silent. The hill was asleep. The lane was asleep. The wood was asleep. The candle in the lantern in the elder man's hand burned low behind its tin shutter, and held, somewhere along the lower line of the lawn, between two thin iron posts that the gardener had driven into the ground at the lower end of the slope. There lay a length of fine wire that no man could have seen in the dark, even with a lantern held close, even with eyes that knew what they were looking for. The two men did not know of the wire. They did not know of the gun in its small wooden box. They did not know of the careful, patient hand that had set them both. The wood at their backs stood as it had stood for centuries. The lamp at the front gate of the lodge burned low. The frost gathered upon the iron railings. The long February night settled once more upon the slope, and the wood was still. Chapter 6. The long hours before dawn. The fence at the foot of the long sloping garden of Muswell Lodge was a low wooden fence of the ordinary suburban pattern, painted black, weathered grey at the tops of its slats by 20 winters of frost and rain, and crossed at intervals by horizontal rails that had been put there by some careful builder of the previous decade to make it stronger against the small persistent leaning of cattle, and against the steady pressure of the wind. It was not a hard fence to climb. A man of average height could set his hand upon the top rail and lift himself up, and swing one leg and then the other, and drop down upon the other side into the soft frozen leaves of the lower lawn. Two men of average height could do the same, one after the other, in the same quiet, careful manner that they had used in the wood behind them. And so, slowly, with the same patient, quiet care, the two figures of the previous chapter passed over the fence at its lowest point, and into the garden, and did not catch the wire that lay between the two thin iron posts a little further along the boundary. The wire was set close to one corner of the long lawn only. It did not run the full length of the lower fence. They had crossed at the only place where the wire was not, and they had crossed by an accident of geometry that the patient old engineer in his bedroom above the slope could not have foreseen. The gun in its small wooden box, 10 yards along the line, slept on, with its trigger uncaught and its powder undisturbed, and its small mechanism still as careful and as ready as the gardener had left it the previous evening at dusk. They stood for a moment in the lower lawn after they had come down, listening. The frosted grass made a thin, brittle sound beneath their boots when either of them shifted his weight. The breath of each of them rose white and fell back upon the cold ground. The house at the head of the slope showed nothing, no light at any of its windows, no movement of any curtain, no breath of smoke from any of its tall chimneys. The lamps of Tetherdown beyond the front of the house glowed faintly above the slate roof, and made of the roof a long dark line against the sky, but they did not reach the back of the building, and the back of the building lay in its own deeper darkness. They began to walk up the slope of the lawn. They walked carefully, with the same kind of patient soundless step that men of their trade learn early and never forget. They walked along the soft edge of one of the gravel paths, where the gravel did not crunch beneath their soles. They passed the bare canes of the fruit trees that the gardener had pruned back in the autumn. They passed the dark heap of leaves that he had swept into the corner of the garden against the long brick wall. They passed the wooden frame of a small cold greenhouse, the glass of it filmed with white frost. The slope flattened as they came to the upper terrace nearer the house. The house stood close before them now, dark and square against the colder sky, with its rear window shuttered behind their inside iron bars, and its back door bolted at the top and bolted at the bottom and chained between. The toy lantern of tin in the elder man's hand sat with its slide closed. A faint sliver of yellow light showed at the seam where the shutter did not quite meet the back of the case. What they did at the back of the house in those next quiet minutes need not be told here in any small detail. for it's the kind of plain mechanical work that the trade has used since houses have had locks, and the telling of it does no credit to anyone. They found, after some patient searching, a window at the side of the building whose iron rod had been left a little loose in its socket, and whose pane could be lifted, and whose catch within could be reached with the fine wire that the younger of them had brought for that purpose in the inside of his coat. They worked at it slowly and silently. The cold metal of the wire bent and bent again in their stiff fingers. The candle in the lantern flickered once and held its small flame. The catch lifted at last with a small soft sound that was no louder than the snap of a frosted twig in the wood behind them, and the window slid up upon its sash cords, and they passed through it one after the other into the kitchen of the house. The kitchen within was a little warmer than the air outside, for the embers of the fire in the range had not yet quite gone out. The smell within was the smell of an old man's kitchen, cold tea, cold bread, soft soap, and the faint dry smell of carbolic. The slide of the lantern was opened by a small, careful degree. The yellow light reached out a few feet upon the stone flags of the floor. What follows of this part of the night must, in any honest telling, be properly held at a distance. There is a class of detail that no listener half asleep should have to carry into the morning, and the long tradition of the chronicler's craft has always held that there is a quiet dignity owed to the dead, and that the worst hours of any life are not the hours that should be made into entertainment for any other life. Mr. Henry Smith, in the room above, was woken at some hour past midnight by sounds that he had not heard in his house before. He came down the wide carpeted staircase in his nightshirt and his slippers with a candle in his hand, because that was what a man of his age and his time and his habit would have done. He met the two men in the hallway at the foot of the stairs, or perhaps in the kitchen doorway, or perhaps upon the landing. The records of the trial are not entirely certain on the point, and there is no need for them to be. He was an old man of 79 years, slight of build, alone in his quiet house at a winter midnight, and he was overcome. They bound his wrists and his ankles with strips torn from a blanket in the spare room. They laid him upon the stone floor of the kitchen, near the dying embers of the range. They gagged him with a piece of cloth. They struck him about the head more than once with the iron bar that the younger of them had carried in his coat. They demanded of him in low voices the combination of the safe that stood in his bedroom upstairs. Whether the old man told them the numbers, or whether he did not tell them and they found another way to it later, is a question to which the answer does not matter very much now. The safe was, in time, opened. The money that lay within it was taken out. The ledgers were left where they had been. The bonds were left. The canvas bags were emptied of their gold sovereigns. The two men moved with the quietness of their trade through the rooms above. They left the drawers of the bureau standing open. They lifted the cloth of the dressing table and looked beneath it. They turned out the small inside pockets of the heavy overcoat hanging in the wardrobe. They worked in their patient and dishonest way for several long hours, and outside the house, all the while, the night went on as the night had gone on every night of that winter. The frost gathered slowly upon the iron railings of the front gate. The lamps of Tetherdown burned low in their tall iron standards, hissing softly to themselves in the cold. The wood at the foot of the long garden stood as it had stood for many centuries. The fox that had passed through the wood at midnight had not come back along its path. The barn owl on its great silent wings crossed the line of the back gardens once, white in the lamplight, and was gone. The cottage where the gardener Charles Webber and his wife slept was dark behind its hedge of holly, and neither of them stirred, for the wind that night was wrong for the carrying of any sound from the back of the main house to the small windows of their bedroom. The houses up and down the lane were dark. The constable upon his beat passed along the high street at his appointed quarter hour, and turned about at the parish boundary stone, and went back upon his round, and did not come down Tetherdown at all upon that pass. The earth went on with its slow, patient turning, as the earth has always done. The hour by which the small candle of a man's life is measured ran out, somewhere in the silent kitchen, and the silence that came afterward was the silence of an end that had been waited for too long. When the two men had finished what they had come to finish, they gathered up the small canvas bags into the inside pockets of their dark coats, and the rolls of gold, and the few notes besides, and they passed back through the kitchen of the house, and they laid their two pocket-knives down upon the stone floor, for what reason no one would ever quite know. Perhaps because the handles of them had become slick with use, perhaps because they had simply been forgotten in the quiet hurry of the last minutes, and they left also upon the corner of the kitchen table, burned table dansed and made its stomach stand of burton of enthaltaligard audited fells and told it whether the elder of them set the lantern down by accident or the younger by accident was a question that the trial of the following May would later argue at some length and would never quite resolve. The lantern stood there upon the table, with the wick of its dying candle smoking faintly into the cold air, and the men passed out of the back door, drawing the bolts behind them with the same careful, patient hands with which they had opened the side window of the kitchen some hours earlier. They went back down the slope of the long garden. They went back over the lower fence, the very same point at which they had crossed it before. They went back into the wood. The wood received them with the same dark silence with which it had received them on the way in. They went away. The night closed behind them as a still pond closes behind a swimmer who has slicked beneath its surface and has not come up again. The kitchen of Muswell Lodge, in the long hours that followed, was a still room with the faint smell of spent candle wick and of cold ash and of something else besides, that no kitchen had ever been meant to hold. The fire in the iron range was out. The clock above the dresser ticked. The shadows of the dresser and the kitchen table lay long across the stone flags. The toy lantern upon the corner of the table smoked itself out and went dark, and a thin curl of soot rose from its tin shade and was gone. The two pocket knives upon the floor caught a faint reflection of the white sky beyond the window glass, where the frost had drawn its slow ferns. The body of the old engineer lay where it had been left, with the strips of blanket binding his wrists and his ankles, and the cloth still tied across his mouth. The dignity of his long, quiet life was still upon him even now. His silver-rimmed reading glasses had slipped from the pocket of his nightshirt and lay folded upon the stones near his hand. His own bedside candle stub, which he had carried down with him at the first sound of the night, lay half-rolled into the corner of the room where it had fallen from his fingers when he had been overcome. In the rooms above, the disarray of the night was complete and quiet. The drawers of the heavy mahogany bureau in the bedroom stood open. The little canvas bags from the safe lay scattered upon the patterned carpet, empty, their drawstrings undone. The wardrobe door swung very slightly upon its hinges in the cold draught from the open window upon the landing. The pillow upon the bed had been turned over. The mattress had been lifted at one corner and set down crooked. The picture frame upon the bedroom mantel had been moved aside, and the small recess behind it inspected, and the frame replaced not quite straight against the wall. The clock upon the bedroom mantel had stopped, for no man had wound it that night. It showed the hour of 1:30 upon its small enamel face. The window glass was filming over, with a new layer of finer frost as the dawn grew slowly nearer. The garden outside lay as it had lain before. The wire at the foot of the lawn was still set between its two thin iron posts. The gun and its small wooden box was still loaded with its careful charge of powder and small shot. The lamp at the front gate burned faintly through the thickening fog of the late hours. The lane was silent. The wood was silent. The whole great quiet machinery of the suburb went on with its sleeping, knowing nothing, hearing nothing, suspecting nothing of what had passed within the walls of the one dark house at the lower end of Tetherdown. The constable upon the High Street passed once more at his appointed hour, and turned and went back upon his round, and saw no light he had not seen before in any of the windows above him. And far off, across the long sleeping country, somewhere beyond the curve of the earth and the cold East Anglian fields and the dark grey water of the German Sea, the sun that none of these eyes would see for some hours yet was beginning to climb out of its own midnight. It would come slowly across the world. It would come slowly across the fens and the inland counties of the kingdom. It would lay its first thin grey light upon the slate roofs of the western parishes of London, and at last, in its own slow patient time, it would creep up the long slope of Muswell Hill, and find the lane, and find the house, and find the kitchen where the fire had gone out, and the clock still ticked above the dresser. The hour for that finding was not yet. The candle had burned low. The hours stood still, and the long dark before the dawn went on, as the long dark before the dawn has gone on in every century, with its own slow patient breathing, and with its own quiet, and with its own waiting, and with its own silence. Chapter 7, A Gardener's Morning Dawn, on the 14th of February in the year 1896, came late and grey across the rooftops of London. The first thin grey light reached the dome of St. Paul's a little before 7 o'clock, and crept thereafter slowly across the smoke of the inner parishes, and crossed the canal at Camden Town, and lifted itself with effort up the long slope of Tufnell Park and Highgate. and came at last, by 7:30, upon the slate roofs and the walled gardens and the quiet lanes of Muswell Hill. It was St. Valentine's Day. It was a Friday. The shopkeepers along the high street were already at their shutters, lifting them up upon their slow chains, and the milkmen with their small carts were already upon their early rounds, and the first thin wisps of coal smoke were already lifting from the chimneys of the new villas along Fortis Green in Colney Hatch Lane, where the maids had risen at 6 and were laying the fires in the kitchens by the light of small paraffin lamps. In the small cottage tucked into the grounds of Muswell Lodge, set a little way from the main house and screened from it by a hedge of holly, the gardener, Charles Webber, rose at his usual hour, which was 7:15, just as he had risen on every working morning of his life. He dressed himself by the light of a single candle upon the dresser. He washed his face and his neck at a basin of cold water that his wife had set out for him the night before upon a folded towel. He combed his hair with a comb of horn that had been his father's before him. He sat at the small kitchen table by the dead grate of the cottage, and ate a thick slice of bread and butter, and drank a mug of strong tea that his wife had made for him before going back to her own warm bed for an hour more. He pulled on his heavy outdoor boots that he had left by the kitchen door, the leather of them stiff with the cold. He put on his old corduroy jacket and his cap of brown wool. He stepped out into the cold of the yard. The frost was upon every stone of the path and upon every blade of grass in the small patch of garden beside the cottage. The air was still and quite without wind. The sky to the east was a pale grey behind the bare branches of the trees in the wood. He went first, as he always went first, to the small wooden shed at the side of the cottage, where he kept his tools and his coal scuttle and his lanterns, and the wooden frames in which the seedlings were started in the spring against the early frosts. He took down a long-handled spade from its peg upon the wall. He took down a small bundle of kindling tied with twine for the fire in the main house. He looked at the sky a moment and thought, as he had thought every morning for nearly a fortnight, that the weather might at last be turning toward the spring. He shouldered his bundle of kindling. He stepped out of the shed and walked across the side path toward the back door of the main house, with the spade across his shoulder and his cap pulled down against the cold and the gravel of the path crunching under the soles of his heavy boots in the quiet of the morning. He came up to the back door of the main house. He set the spade against the wall beside it. He raised his hand to the doorknob in the manner of habit, and he saw, in the slow, careful way a man sees a thing that he has not been expecting at all, that the door was not properly closed. The heavy bolt at the top was drawn back. The bolt at the bottom was drawn back. The chain hung loose against the doorpost. The door itself stood a hair's breadth open, and the cold morning air of the yard was running into the kitchen beyond it. He stood quite still for a long moment, with his hand still half raised toward the knob. He listened. He heard nothing from within the house. He listened again. The clock above the dresser inside ticked through the silence, as it had always ticked. The pump in the corner did not drip, because the pipes had been frozen for many days. He pushed the door slowly open. The kitchen of Muswell Lodge on that morning was a room he had been into more times than he could have begun to count. He had stood in it on 1,000 winter mornings to draw a fresh pail of water from the small pump in the corner, and had crossed it on 1,000 summer afternoons with a basket of vegetables from the kitchen garden for the cook, and had warmed his stiff red hands at its iron range on 1,000 other days, when the master had called him in for a word about the apple tree or the laurel hedge or the gravel of the front path. He knew the room and its smells, which were the smells of soft soap and cold tea and old wood. He knew its sounds, which were the small ticking of the clock above the dresser and the slow drip of the tap into the stone sink. But he did not know the kitchen that he stepped into on that morning. The clock still ticked. The tap did not drip. The smell within was not the smell he knew. There was a sharper smell beneath the old familiar one, a smell he could not at first quite name, although his stomach had named it before his slow mind had begun to ask. He stood in the doorway and looked into the room. He saw, upon the stone flags of the kitchen floor, near the dead embers of the range, the figure of the master of the house. He did not need a second glance to know what he was looking at. He did not need to step into the room. He set his hand upon the doorpost to steady himself against the sudden weakness in his knees. He drew one breath, and then another. He looked once more, and not for long. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, back across the yard and through the side path, and out at the small iron gate of the back garden into the lane, and he began to run. He ran first to the cottage of his nearest neighbour along the lane, a man whose name was known to him, and who was just at that hour rising and washing, and who came to the front door in his shirt-sleeves at the sound of Webber's quick, urgent knocking. He told him in a few short, low sentences spoken between breaths what he had found at the back of the house. The neighbour went back into his cottage to fetch his coat and his boots. Mr. Webber ran on. He ran to the next house along the lane, and roused another neighbour at his own breakfast, and after that he ran down the long lane to the High Street, and he stopped at the brass plate beside the front door of Dr. Ridley Webster, who was at his own breakfast in the small parlour behind the consulting room. The doctor was a careful and methodical man of the older school, who answered every knock at his door at any hour of the day or night, and who came out at once with Webber into the cold, in his black overcoat, with his small black bag in his hand, and the two of them returned up Tetherdown together at a pace that was almost a run. Webber was breathing hard. The doctor said little. The lane between the bare hedges was quiet, and the rooks went up out of a tree as the two men passed beneath it. A constable was found at the corner of Tetherdown and the High Street, in his tall helmet, just coming off the long, quiet beat of the early morning. He was told what had happened in a few short sentences. He turned and walked back up the lane with the gardener and the doctor, his cape held close about his shoulders, his hands behind his back. A second constable, summoned from the parish telephone in the High Street, would arrive a little later upon his bicycle. A note would be sent at once to the police station of the Y Division of the Metropolitan Police, and from there a message would go upon the wire to Scotland Yard. By the middle of the morning, the senior officers of the yard would be on their way up the lane in a closed brougham. By the early afternoon, the small inquest room of the parish would be opened to receive the body of the master of the house. By the evening, the news would be in every public house from Hornsey to Holloway. But all of that was yet to come. At 8:15 in the morning, on the 14th of February 1896, there were only 4 men standing in the kitchen of Muswell Lodge, the gardener, the doctor, the first constable, and the master of the house, who lay upon the stones beneath them all, and could not stand at all. The doctor knelt down beside the body of Mr. Henry Smith. He examined the bonds upon the wrists. He examined the gag. He examined the wounds upon the head with the slow, steady hands of 40 years of practice. He spoke a few quiet words to the constable beside him, who had taken out a small black notebook and a stub of pencil. He pronounced the master of the house to be dead, and he gave it as his best opinion that death had occurred some several hours before, perhaps in the small hours of the night. He stood up. He took off his hat. The constable closed his notebook. The gardener Webber stood in the doorway with his hand still upon the doorpost. The kitchen clock above the dresser ticked through it all, slow and steady, as it had ticked through every other quiet morning of every other quiet year. The constable was the first to look about the room properly. He noted, with care and in good order, the things that were in it that should not have been in it. He noted the 2 pocket knives lying upon the stone flags beside the body of the master. He noted the small toy lantern of tin upon the corner of the kitchen table, with its candle burned to nothing, and a thin curl of greasy soot upon its tin shade. He noted the strips of cloth torn from a blanket in the spare room, which had been used for the binding. He noted, when in time he and his sergeant had climbed the wide carpeted stairs to look about the rooms above, the disturbance in the bedroom, the open drawers of the bureau, the lifted corner of the mattress, the picture frame moved slightly aside above the small marble fireplace. He noted the safe in the bedroom standing open, its handle hanging downward upon its bracket. Its inner shelves swept clean of the canvas bags that had lain there. He noted the rooms below as he came back down, looking for any small clue that the upper rooms had not given him. He paused in particular over the small toy lantern of tin upon the kitchen table. He picked it up between 2 careful fingers. He held it up to the thin grey light from the kitchen window. He turned it slowly in his hand. He set it back down upon the table where it had been. He said nothing. By 10 in the morning the news of the murder at Muswell Lodge had reached the High Street. By 11 it had reached the small office of the local paper, the Hornsey Journal, where the editor stopped the press of the Saturday edition to insert a column of close-set type beneath a bold black headline. By 12 the news had reached the daily papers in Fleet Street, and by the afternoon trains it was carried out through every county of England. The boys of the suburb stopped in the lane on their way home from school, and craned their heads at the iron gate of the lodge, and looked up the gravel path between the laurels, and saw the figures of the police moving about the front porch, and did not know quite what they were seeing, but knew that they were seeing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. The wives of the lane stood at their front windows behind drawn lace curtains and watched in silence. A small knot of men gathered at the brass bell of the gate, and were moved on by the constable, and gathered again a little way along the lane. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the closed brougham of an inspector was at the front gate. By 5, the body of the master had been removed. By the morning of Sunday, the 16th of February, the lane of Tetherdown was no longer the lane of Tetherdown that the people of the suburb had known. The Hornsey Journal of that week reported, in its calm, careful columns, that the morbid curiosity of the public had brought hundreds and then thousands of people up the hill on the Sunday to gather at the gate of the lodge and stare in at the laurels and the gravel path. Some accounts of the crowd gave the figure as 1,500. Some put it at 2,000. The constables of the parish were quite overcome by the numbers. The crowd moved up and down the lane all day. It pressed against the iron gates. It pointed. It whispered. It looked. The gardener Charles Webber, who had returned to his small cottage and who had not yet been able to bring himself to enter the main house again, kept the curtains of his front window drawn against the day. His wife brought him cups of tea that he did not drink. He sat by the fire and looked at his thick gardener's hands resting upon his knees. The crowd outside the gate went on with its slow shuffling. The day passed. The dusk came down upon Tetherdown. The lamplighter came along the lane with his long pole. The crowd thinned away. The lamps glowed in their iron standards. The frost gathered again upon the gravel. And somewhere upon the stones of a parish mortuary, a few miles away, the body of Mr. Henry Smith, of Muswell Lodge, in the parish of Hornsey, in the county of Middlesex, in the 79th year of his age, lay quietly under a clean white sheet. The lamp above him burned low. The hour was late. The clock upon the wall of the room ticked through the silence. And the long, careful work of the slow human business of justice, of the inquest and the inquiry, and the laying out of all the small evidence into its proper order, was already beginning in its patient, quiet way, far off, in the small offices of a great machine that had not yet found the names of any of the figures who had passed through this story. The night drew on. The lamps went out one by one along the high street. The wood at the foot of Tetherdown stood as it had all stood, and the long February dark settled once more upon the slope and was still. Chapter 8. The Toy Lantern. The work that began in the kitchen of Muswell Lodge on the morning of the 14th of February did not end with the carrying away of the body in the closed brougham, nor with the laying out of the small pieces of evidence upon the broad oak table of the parish inquest room later that same afternoon, for the slow, careful labour that had begun in that quiet stone-flagged at Sone flagged the shoed. Id the long road had becunned. Id our tight down the chid. Had the long road becaused police left the wide thishis of the George of Divda to Bafsht, for that device to remain that twits rebase it was, in the slow and careful way of the work of the Metropolitan Police of that time, the first day of an inquiry that would run on for nearly 2 months across half the south of England, and that would draw in the careful, patient attention of inspectors and sergeants and country constables, in towns whose names neither the master of Muswell Lodge nor the men who had broken into his house had ever spoken in their lives. The inquiry would in time be called, by those who wrote of these things in the long evening papers of that year, the most patient piece of detective work that the Yard had carried out in many seasons. The inquiry would also be called by other men of the trade, simply the case of the broken lantern. By either name, it began that Friday morning upon Tetherdown, with one careful constable holding a small tin object up to the thin grey light of the kitchen window and turning it slowly, and saying nothing at all. The constable, when he had set the lantern back down upon the kitchen table, said nothing of it at that moment, because the constable was a careful man, and was not in the habit of speaking until he had finished his looking. But he kept the lantern in his eye through all the rest of the morning's work, and he kept it in his mind through the whole of the journey back into the city in the inspector's brougham, and he kept it on his desk for a long, quiet half-hour after he came back into the office of the Yeye Division and had hung up his cape upon the peg behind the door. When the sergeant came up the lane from the High Street, the constable had shown him the lantern. When the inspector came up the lane in the closed brougham from the yard, the constable had shown him the lantern. By the noon of that long winter day, the lantern had been wrapped in a piece of clean white cloth and laid in a small cardboard box and taken away in the carriage, along with the 2 pocket knives from the floor of the kitchen and the strips of cloth from the binding and a careful written list of the goods missing from the safe upstairs. By the early afternoon, The lantern was upon the desk of a senior detective in a quiet office of New Scotland Yard, where it was looked at again, and turned over once more, and weighed in the palm, and noted in a long ledger of small evidence, and locked at last into a low wooden cupboard with a heavy brass key. The lantern itself was a small plain thing of pressed tin, no larger than a man's clenched fist, of the kind that any chandler in any back street in London sold for fourpence to any working man who had a child for whom he wished to buy a toy upon a Saturday afternoon. It had a small ring at the top for the hanging of it from a hook, and a small handle for the carrying of it through a dark room, and a small tin shutter that slid open and slid closed to let the light out, or to keep it in. It had a stub of common candle within, melted nearly to the metal of the base. It had a wick of cotton twist that had burned down to a thin black thread of ash. It had no name upon it, no mark of any particular maker, no scratch of any individual hand to set it apart from any other. It was one of perhaps several 100,000 such lanterns that had passed through the small shops of the city in the previous few years alone. It was, by any reasonable measure of the slow work of detection, the worst kind of clue that a careful officer might be asked to follow. It was also, by another measure quite as reasonable, the only clue that the officers had. The newspapers of the weeks that followed reported the slow inquiry with a kind of patient frustration that was very nearly its own form of news, because the slow inquiry itself was slow and patient, and frustrating to all who watched it. The public, who in the first days after the discovery had pressed in their thousands at the iron gate of Muswell Lodge to look up the gravel path between the laurels, had grown tired by the end of February of waiting for an arrest that did not come. The crowds along Tetherdown thinned to a few stragglers. The boys of the suburb no longer stopped at the gate on their way home from school. The columns in the Hornsey Journal shrank from week to week, as fresher matters took their place. A man drowned in the canal at Stratford, a runaway horse in the High Street of Highgate, a question in the parish council concerning the new drains at Fortis Green. Letters were written to the editors of the daily papers, in the long, careful sentences of late Victorian outrage, demanding to know what the police were doing about the case of the old engineer at Muswell Hill. The police were doing, as it happened, all that they could do. They were following the lantern. The lantern, in those long weeks, was carried by careful men in plain coats to every chandler's shop in West London, first of all, and then to every chandler in the inner parishes of the city, and then to every chandler in any street within reach of the railway lines that ran north from the river to the suburbs along the great northern slope. It was held up before 100 shopkeepers behind 100 small wooden counters, who looked at it with mild interest and shook their heads, and said that yes, they sold such lanterns, and yes, they had sold many in their time, and no, they could not say to whom any one of them had gone. The inspector and his men listened patiently to every answer, and made small careful notes in their small black books. They tried the pawnbrokers next. They tried the schools suppliers. They tried the costermongers who carried such cheap small toys upon a tray slung from the neck along the streets of the poorer districts on a Saturday afternoon. They tried, after some weeks of this slow, patient walking, the curious idea that perhaps the lantern had been made not in some London factory at all, but in a kitchen at home, by some person of small, careful, patient skill with a turn for the working of tin. They sent the lantern to a man at Woolwich who knew about tin. He said that it might have been bought from a shop, or it might have been made by hand. He could not tell them with any certainty which it was. It is the way of the work of detection that the answer, when it comes, does not always come from the clue itself, and that often the clue only confirms what some quite different stroke has already shown. In the case of the lantern, the answer came at last from a memory. There was, in the Y Division of the Metropolitan Police, a sergeant who had risen to the rank of detective in the slow, careful way of his long service, by some 20 years of patient walking along the streets of the western parishes, and whose name was William Burrell. He was a man of plain manners and quiet habit. He kept no notebook in his breast pocket, because he kept all of his notebooks inside his head. He knew, by name and by face, very nearly every man and woman of the small dishonest trade in his part of the city. He had watched them come and go for 2 decades. He had watched their wives. He had watched their lodgers. He had watched with very particular attention the comings and goings of the men he had once helped to send away to the cold prisons upon the moor and to the long stone galleries of Pentonville, and he had watched them again after they had come out upon their tickets of leave, and he had marked them quietly in his memory as they had gone back to their old streets. He had marked, in particular, a small man named Albert Milsom, who had kept a house in Southam Street with his wife, and who had been known to the sergeant for some years. He had marked the disappearance of this Milsom from Southam Street in the days that followed the murder at Muswell Hill. He had marked also the disappearance, at about the same time and in much the same quiet manner, of a younger and heavier man named Henry Fowler, who had been seen drinking in the public houses of Kilburn through the late winter in the company of Milsom, and who had served a long stretch upon the moor at Dartmoor for an earlier piece of breaking and entering, and who had come out upon his ticket only some months before. He had marked, finally, that the wife of Milsom was the elder sister of a young boy named Henry Miller, who had lodged with the Milsoms in the house at Southam Street, and whose small toy lantern of tin, bought for fourpence at a corner shop in Kensington the previous autumn, had not been seen upon the dresser of that kitchen at Southam Street since some time in the second week of February, the very week of the murder at Muswell Hill. The Sergeant Burrell sat at his small desk in the quiet office of the Y Division and wrote out a single short, careful note to the senior inspectors at Scotland Yard. The note brought a senior inspector to the door of that small office within the week. The senior inspector listened to what the sergeant had to say, and looked at the note again, and took the sergeant's information across to the yard with him in his closed brougham that same afternoon. From the yard, the inquiry now set out in two directions at once, in the careful, patient way of these matters. One officer was sent quietly to find the young boy Miller, who had since been parted from his sister and was lodging elsewhere, and to put the small toy lantern from the parish mortuary into his hand. The boy took the lantern. The boy turned it slowly in his fingers. The boy said that it was his. He said that the wick within it had been cut from an old piece of cotton that his elder sister had used in the making of small children's dresses. He said that the lantern had always been kept upon the dresser of the kitchen at Southam Street. He said that he had not seen it upon the dresser since the second week of February. The man of the yard took down the boy's statement word for word in a small black book. The other direction was the slow and patient business of finding where the man Milsom and the man Fowler had gone, because they had not stayed in Kensal Town, and they had not stayed in Kilburn, and they had not stayed in any of the streets in which they were known. The yard sent out word along the wire to the police forces of the country towns. The yard watched the railway stations. The yard watched the ports. The yard watched the public houses of every district from Liverpool down to Plymouth, and from Southampton up to Newcastle. The weeks went on. March came. The crocuses appeared upon the heath. The frost gave way at last to the soft cold rains of an early spring. The Hornsey Journal had stopped carrying the case altogether, and then, in the second week of April, a quiet word came at last up from the country, from a constable upon his beat in a small town upon the Avon, who had noticed the new lodgers in a house in a street called Monmouth Street, and who had thought the faces of those lodgers familiar from a notice that had passed across his sergeant's desk some weeks earlier. The town was Bath. The house was a plain lodging-house with rooms above and a small shop below. The two men inside it had given different names to the landlady upon their arrival, and a woman who passed as the wife of one of them had given another name again. But the constable upon his beat had seen the men once at the door, and had seen them twice in the street, and had at last sent his careful written note up the line. Chief Inspector Marshal of the Metropolitan Police left Paddington for the west by the first available train. He carried a heavy walking stick of stout oak. He stopped at Swindon for the night. He went on by the local line through Chippenham. He came at last to Bath upon a Sunday morning, the 12th of April, and he met the constable at the police station, and the constable led him through the narrow grey stone streets of the older town toward the door of the house in Monmouth Street. What followed at the door of that house was the work of perhaps 3 minutes only, and yet it was the moment toward which the whole of the patient long work of the previous 2 months had been carefully bent. The inspector knocked at the door of the lodging-house. The landlady opened it. The inspector asked, in his careful, quiet way, to be allowed to see her lodgers above. The landlady, sensing in some half-aware manner the slow weight of the law in the cold, polite voice of the man at her door, stood aside. The inspector and the constable mounted the narrow stair together. They came into a small lodging-room above. The two men inside it were not at first willing to come quietly. There was a brief struggle in the doorway. The stout walking stick of the inspector was broken across a raised forearm. A chair was overturned upon the floor. A small lamp upon the table went down in a flare of paraffin. But within perhaps 3 minutes more, the two men were upon the floor of the room, with the iron handcuffs upon their wrists, and the woman beside them was held by the elbow at the door. And the long, quiet work of the yard at last was done. They were taken at once, without their hats, down the narrow stair, and out into the cold light of the Bath Street, and along to the police station, and from there in time to a closed carriage, and to the railway station, and to the long slow train back to London. They did not speak upon the journey. The inspector watched them. The constables watched them. The dark spring country slid past the window of the carriage. The river of the Avon shone faintly at the edges of small towns. The lamps of the country stations came on one by one as the train went east. By the evening of that 12th day of April, the two men were in the cells of Newgate Prison, and the news of the arrest was upon the wire to every editor in Fleet Street, and the first thin column of small print was already being set up by the slow, careful compositors of the Monday morning papers, and the long, quiet inquiry that had begun in a kitchen on Tetherdown 9 weeks earlier had reached the end of its first careful chapter. There would be a longer chapter to come. The lamps of Bath glowed faintly along the curve of the river. The lamps of London glowed in the wet streets beyond the prison wall. The wind moved softly along Tetherdown, far to the north of the city, where the gardener Charles Webber still slept badly in his cottage, and where the laurels of Muswell Lodge stood untrimmed at the front gate, and where the iron bell beside the gate had not been rung in many weeks. The night came down. The case had turned. Chapter 9. The Old Bailey in May. The Old Bailey of the year 1896 stood at the same corner of the inner city at which the Old Bailey stands still in our own day, on the western side of the long quiet street that bears the same name, with the high blank walls of Newgate Prison rising heavily next to it. The two buildings were not separated in any meaningful way. They were joined, in the manner of the older order of English justice, by a covered passage of iron latticed roof and bare flagged floor that ran between them at the back of their courtyards, and that bore the name of Birdcage Walk among the prison men, and the older name of Dead Man's Walk among those who had passed along it for the last time on their way out to the gallows in the years before such matters had been moved at last indoors. The prison wall ran along Newgate Street. The court wall ran down the Old Bailey. The two together made one black-bricked, soot-stained, weather-streaked monument to the slow grinding patience of the law of the kingdom, beneath a smoke-dark sky that, in the long evenings of that warm spring, hung red above the river to the south, and that, in the cold mornings, hung grey above the roof to the south, and that, in the cold mornings, hung grey above the roof-tops, and lard, at noon, hung yellow with the rising of the chimney smoke from every house and laundry of the inner parishes. Within the walls of the Central Criminal Court, the work of the spring sessions had been going on with its usual order. Cases of forgery and of receiving stolen property and of grand larceny and of manslaughter and of murder had been heard in their turn, one after another, before juries of 12 plain men sworn in from the rate books of the surrounding parishes. The judges of the bench had come and gone in their crimson robes and their long horsehair wigs of the 18th century. The barristers, in their black silk and their white starched bands, had risen and bowed and sat down again at every change of witness. The clerks at their long bench beneath the dock had written down the slow, careful answers of those witnesses upon the lines of their printed forms, in the patient round hand of their profession. The ushers in their black gowns had called the names of the parties in low voices from the doorways. The galleries above had filled and emptied and filled again with the ratepayers and the curious and the law students, and the wives of small clerks and the ladies of the better sort, who came in to see the great show that the law of the country put on for any who cared to climb the narrow stair behind the corner of the porch. It was, in the year 1896, a public theatre as well as a court of the kingdom, and it had been so for as long as any man living could remember. On the morning of the 18th of May in the year 1896, the trial of the case of the murder at Muswell Hill was opened in the largest of the four courts of the Old Bailey. The court itself was a high-panelled room of dark oak and pale plaster, with a high carved bench at one end for the judge, and a long raised dock at the back of the room for the prisoners, and a witness box like a small wooden pulpit standing between the two, and benches for the barristers in a long deep pit beneath the witness box, and behind the barristers a railed enclosure for the public, and above the public a gallery for those who could not find any place below. There were gas jets in brass brackets along the panelling of the walls, and a chandelier of cut glass that had hung in the middle of the high ceiling for half a century, and large windows in iron frames set high above the panelling, and the morning light of late May came down through those windows in slow soft shafts that crossed the floor of the court, at a long slant, and lit the heads of the men and the women below from a high and patient distance. At the head of the bench, in the high carved chair beneath the painted royal arms of the kingdom, sat Mr. Justice Sir Henry Hawkins, a judge of the Queen's Bench of long and quite particular reputation, who had presided over many of the most serious trials of the country in the previous 20 years, and who was known across the profession by the dry, quiet name of the hanging judge. Not, his friends would have said, because he was given to harshness of his own nature, but because in his courtroom the worst crimes were brought always to their proper punishments, in the proper order. He was an old man now in his middle 70s, of a small spare build, with a long pale face and small bright eyes and a thin patient mouth, and he sat upon the bench in his long red robe, and his short white wig, with the still careful watchfulness of a man who had heard every story that men could tell in a court of law, and who waited only to hear it told to him again. The two prisoners were brought up from the cells below the court at the appointed hour by two warders apiece. They climbed the narrow iron stair up into the dock at the back of the room. They came up first, the smaller and the slighter of the two, the man Milsom, in a dark suit of clothes that the prison had given him for the trial, with his thin face pale above his collar and his small hands folded in front of him at the rail. They came up second, the heavier and the stronger of the two, the man Fowler, in a similar dark suit, with a small dark beard upon his chin and his eyes fixed straight ahead before him. The two of them stood at opposite ends of the long dock. The warders took up their positions behind them. The clerk read out the indictment in his slow, careful voice into the high quiet of the room. The two men listened to the indictment without moving. Each pleaded not guilty when his name was called by the clerk. The trial began. It is not necessary in the telling of this story to set out the trial in its full, slow, careful detail, for the trials of the late Victorian courts were long and patient affairs that ran often for 3 days and 4, and the calling of every witness and the asking of every question would fill many evenings of any narrator's careful work. The shape of the case, however, may be told here in a shorter form, and that shape is enough for the purpose of this telling. The prosecution called the gardener Charles Webber, who described in his plain, quiet country voice the morning of the discovery in the kitchen of his master's house. The prosecution called Dr. Ridley Webster, who described in careful detail the body upon the stone flags. The prosecution called the constable, who described the small things he had noted in the kitchen. The prosecution called Detective Sergeant William Burrell, who described how the lantern had been traced from the kitchen of Muswell Lodge across the city to the kitchen of a house in Southam Street, and from there to the boy Henry Miller. The boy himself was called, and described how he had owned the lantern, and how he had not seen it after the night of the 13th of February. The prosecution called Chief Inspector Marshall, who described the long, quiet arrest at the door of the lodging-house in Monmouth Street, in the town of Bath. The prosecution called a long string of small witnesses besides, the booking clerk from the railway station near Kilburn, the landlord of the public-house in Kilburn High Road, the constables upon the country line, the landlady of the lodging-house in Bath. And each of these gave their small piece of the picture in its turn. And the picture grew quietly in the room as the witnesses passed in and out of the box, and by the afternoon of the second day of the trial, the picture in that room was clear. The defence of the case, when the prosecution had at last finished its long, careful labour, took the form that the long memory of the courts has since given the name of the cutthroat defence, which is to say, the form in which two prisoners, accused together of the same crime, blame the crime each upon the other in the hope that the jury will not be able to make up its mind which of them did it, and will let them both go free. It is, in the long history of the criminal courts of the kingdom, a very old defence indeed, and it is, in that same long history, very rarely a successful one, because a jury of plain rate-paying men, when faced with two men each saying that the other did it, will more often conclude that the two of them did it together than that either of them did it together than that either of them did not do it at all. So it was upon this occasion. The prisoner Milsom went into the witness box and gave his account of the night of the 13th of February, and said that he had taken part in the breaking in, but had rung from the kitchen when his companion began the violence within it, and had been brought back unwillingly, only at his companion's order. The prisoner Fowler went into the witness box in his turn, and gave a quite different account, and said that his companion had been the one to do the killing while he himself had stood without. The two accounts could not both be true. The two accounts could very easily both be false. The jury sat in its long box at the side of the room and listened. The judge upon his bench listened with his small bright eyes upon the witness box. The court listened. The long afternoon wore on toward the evening. It was somewhere in the long pause that came after the close of the evidence. When the jury had been sent out at last to consider their verdict, and the court had been left in a kind of low murmuring stillness, and the two prisoners had for some unaccountable reason been left standing together in the dock with only one warder between them, that the older quarrel between the two men broke out at last in the open in a manner that no man in the room would afterward forget. The man Fowler, without any warning of which the warder beside him could later speak with certainty, turned upon his companion and sprang upon him with both hands raised and his face quite altered, and he seized the smaller man by the throat above the collar and bore him down hard against the rail of the dock, and there was for a long second the strange silent struggle of the two of them, the heavier man upon the slighter beneath before the warders of the dock, and a clerk from the floor below and two officers from the body of the court came forward and pulled the heavier man. The court, which had been low and murmuring, was for the first long moment entirely silent. The judge, upon his high bench, did not move. He watched. He waited. The two men were separated. The smaller man stood up again at the rail, gasping for breath, his collar undone at the throat. The slow order of the room was restored. The jury, who had been outside in their small panelled room, knew nothing of any of it until they came back in. The jury came back in not long afterward. They had not been long out. The foreman stood up in his place when his name was called. The clerk asked the question that the clerks of those courts had asked through every century of their long use. The foreman gave his answer in a steady, plain voice. The verdict was guilty against each of the prisoners upon the charge of wilful murder. The two men stood in the dock without speaking. The smaller of them, when his sentence came at last to be passed, sat down upon the bench of the dock and put his face into his hands. The heavier of them stood with his head up and his mouth set in a thin line, and seemed to listen as though to a sermon that did not properly concern him. The judge upon the high bench took up the small square of black cloth that lay folded upon the desk beside his papers, and he laid it upon his head over the short white horsehair of his wig, in the manner that the judges of the kingdom had used for many centuries, and he spoke the slow, careful words of the sentence into the high-panelled silence of the room. The court listened. The two men listened. The words went out into the room and into the long memory of the courts of the kingdom. The gas jets along the panelling burned low above the dark oak. The afternoon light from the high windows had grown thin upon the floor. The two prisoners were taken down out of the dock by the narrow iron stair at the back of the room, by their warders in silence. They were taken across the dim, flagged passage of Birdcage Walk under its iron-latticed roof, and they were taken in through the high iron-studded door of Newgate Prison, and they were placed in their condemned cells upon the upper landing. The court above them was emptied of its public and its barristers and its witnesses and its clerks. The judge climbed down at last from the high bench in his long red robe, and went out by the small private door at the back of his chamber, and was driven home in a closed room along the wet streets of the inner city. The empty gallery above was swept by an old woman with a long broom of birch. The gas jets along the panelling were turned down one by one. The big chandelier in the middle of the ceiling was extinguished. The chair upon the bench stood empty. The long dock stood empty. The court itself was left to its silence, and to its long memory, and to the slow patient ticking of the small clerk's clock upon the wall behind the witness box. And in the cells beyond the prison wall, the two prisoners began the long careful waiting of their last few weeks upon the earth. The great bell of St. Sepulchre's, which had tolled for the condemned of Newgate for many centuries, hung silent in its high tower across the road, waiting for its appointed day. The May evenings drew on slowly toward the long warm light of June. The small roses along the parish gardens of the inner city began their first slow swelling toward their summer bloom, and the long careful work of the slow human business of the justice of the kingdom, which had begun in a quiet kitchen on Tetherdown 3 months earlier, drew quietly toward its appointed end. Chapter 10. The Black Flag. The morning of the 9th of June in the year 1896 broke warm and clear above the rooftops of the inner city. It was a Tuesday. It was a few days short of midsummer. The sun came up at 4 upon the long quiet stretch of the Thames, and crossed the eastern parishes and lifted itself upward through the high black smoke of the breweries and the gasworks at the rim of the city, and laid its slow warm yellow light at last upon the dark soot streaked walls of Newgate Prison, on the corner of the Old Bailey, where the men of the watch had already been up for some hours, and where the gallows in the small inner shed had been tested with sacks of sand the previous evening to the weights of the 3 men who were to be brought up to it. That morning, the crowd outside the prison had begun to gather in the small hours of the night, in the slow, patient way of such crowds in such places in those years. By 6 o'clock there were perhaps 1,000 people standing along the curb of the Old Bailey beneath the lamps. By 8 o'clock there were nearly 4,000 pressed close together along both sides of the street, with the women among them lifting children upon their shoulders to see better, and the men among them turning their soft hats in their hands, and the boys among them climbing the iron railings of the closed shops to find a place to stand. The traffic of the inner city was stopped along that whole length of the road. The constables of the parish kept the crowd to the pavement and to the gutters, and out of the long carriageway. The public houses upon the corners had opened early in expectation of the trade. The hawkers had come down from the markets with trays of cold meat and bread. It was, despite the long careful progress of the century, still a kind of fair day in the older meaning of that word. The hangings themselves were no longer public. That older order had been put away at last in the year 1868, almost 30 years before. But the gathering at the gate and the watching for the black flag upon the staff had not been put away with it, and was not to be put away for some long years yet to come. Within the walls of the prison the morning had gone on, since the very early hours, in its own slow careful order. The executioner, a man named James Billington, who had come down by the night train from his home in the north of England, with his small black bag at his feet, had been astir at 6. He had 2 assistants of his trade beside him that morning. He had tested the ropes the previous evening with sacks of sand brought up from the yard. He had calculated the drops of each man by the small printed tables of his profession. The bell of the parish church of St. Sepulchre across the road, which had tolled for the condemned of Newgate for many centuries, began as 8:45 its slow steady note above the warm June air, and the crowd in the street below grew quiet to listen to it. The yellow light of the morning lay upon the slates of the long prison roof. The 3 men were brought out of their cells upon the upper landing one after the other, in the order that had been arranged the previous day by the governor and the under-sheriffs to prevent any further trouble between the 2 prisoners from Muswell Hill, who had not been able to be brought to look upon one another since the day of the verdict in the court. A 3rd man, who had committed his own quite separate crime in a quite separate house in Whitechapel some weeks before. A diver named William Seaman, who had killed an elderly umbrella-maker and his housekeeper at Turner Street in the parish of Mile End, was placed in the middle of the small procession, so as to keep the 2 others quite apart from one another upon the long iron beam at the head of the execution shed. The 3rd man, as he was led to his place between the other 2, is recorded by the chroniclers of the day to have said softly, in a voice that was heard by the warders standing nearest to him, that it was the first time in his life that he had ever been a peacemaker. It is the only sentence of that quiet, warm morning that the long memory of the city has kept whole. The other words that were spoken in the execution shed in those few short minutes are not recorded, and they need not be. The 3 men were placed in their 3 places upon the long beam. The hangman did his slow, careful work. The great bell of St. Sepulchre tolled on across the road. At a few minutes past the hour of 9, the long, quiet thud that the people in the street below had been waiting for was heard within the walls. The crowd outside was silent for the space of perhaps 3 breaths. Then it began its long, shuffling movement of departure, as the under-sheriffs upon the prison roof ran up the black flag upon the small staff at the gable, and the small dark square of cloth hung still upon the warm June air against the pale sky above the city. What was done afterward within the walls was done in the order that the prison had used for very many lifetimes. The 3 bodies were cut down after the proper hour. They were laid in plain black coffins of pine. They were buried, in the early afternoon, beneath the flagstones of the long-covered passage at the back of the courtyard, the passage that the men of the prison called Birdcage Walk for its iron-latticed roof, and that the older men of the city had once called Deadman's Walk for the long line of those who had passed along it on their way out to die. The initials of the surnames of the 3 men were carved into the stones of the wall above the place where the coffins had gone down. The flagstones were set back. The masons closed the work. The long quiet ledger of Newgate was opened, and 3 more names were entered in their proper places upon it. The great bell of St. Sepulchre fell silent at last upon its rope in the tower across the road. The crowd in the Old Bailey had quite gone by midday. The traffic of the inner city resumed along the carriageway. The day went on, and from that morning the years began their slow, patient turning, as the years have always done. The Queen, who had sat upon the throne of the kingdom for so many long winters, lived on for another 5 summers, and then at last laid herself down in her bed in her great house upon the Isle of Wight, and the long century that had borne her name closed quietly with the closing of her eyes. Her son took up the crown after her, and was crowned and reigned for 9 years, and was followed in his turn by his own son. The new century brought its slow small changes upon the streets of the city. The horse-drawn omnibuses gave way at last to the motor omnibuses. The gas lamps gave way, one street at a time, to the electric lamps. The smoke of the chimneys grew thinner as the new fires came in. The fog of the long winter mornings grew less, year by year, until it was at last only the memory of an older time. Newgate Prison itself was closed in the spring of 1902, when its last prisoner was led away through its high iron-studded door, and within a few years afterward the great black bricked building was pulled down to its foundations, and the bodies that had lain beneath the flagstones of Birdcage Walk were lifted out and removed to another burying place, and a new and lighter building was raised upon the corner of the Old Bailey, the central criminal court of the kingdom, which stands at that corner still, and which the people of the city still call by the older name of the street, a Pound Witchen, Spenny. The long slope of Muswell Hill, in those same slow years, gave up the last of its old fields to the new building. The estate called the Limes, which had been auctioned in the spring of 1896, had its great house pulled down, and its garden cut into streets, and its lime trees taken away, and the new villas of the next generation rose along the lines of the new roads. The lane called Tetherdam filled in along its western side with smaller houses, and the western frontage of the lane was complete by the year 1908. In that same year, the long back garden of Muswell Lodge, which had run down the slope toward the wood, and through which 2 figures had walked upward in the dark of a February night some 12 years earlier, was cut through by a new road and lined upon both its sides with new houses, and that new road was named Burlington Road. The lodge itself was pulled down to the ground. Its iron gate was taken away. Its laurels were taken out. Its gravel path was lifted. The brick wall that had once enclosed the back garden was taken down stone by stone and carried away in a builder's cart. By the end of 1908, there was no man walking along that new road who could have said, without being told, where the lodge had ever stood. The wood at the foot of the slope did not go. Its southern part was felled in the years between the 2 great wars, and the timber sold off, and the ground beneath taken for the building of 2 new schools and a long row of houses along the southern boundary. But the heart of the wood was bought in the year 1930 by the council of the parish, which is the council that holds it still in its careful keeping. It has been managed since by the borough of Haringey, with the help of those who live near it, and was declared in the year 2013 a local nature reserve, the small careful name that the modern law gives to the very old land that has somehow come through. Its oaks are still there. The old earth bank with its outer ditch is still there. The deep leaf mould lies beneath the trees. The boys and girls of the new century still come into it on bright Saturdays to gather sticks and to look for foxes, and to climb upon the fallen branches that lie across its narrow paths. The fox still moves at night between the trunks. The owl still crosses the line of its boundary at the falling of the dusk. The wood is the one thing in this story that has not changed. If a listener wake hisn't tinian, at it from the pletion at Steffner the itchen along the old High Street, and turn at last into the lane called Tetherdam, which is still runs down the slope toward the wood, that listener would find that the lane called Tetherdown, which is still runs down the slope toward the wood, that listener would find down that's lain its pave. Spil the long Kate slits, its lower bird sign, it would slays low shit spelled. It's loud but spebeld out bolts and as kuts lumid and cooks it elk. At the corner of Burlington Road and the western side of Tetherdown stands a row of plain, late Victorian houses of red brick and stone, much like the houses of any quiet street in the northern suburbs of London. There is no plaque upon the wall of any of them. There is no marker set upon the pavement. There is no sign that says what once stood there. The front garden of Muswell Lodge lies beneath these houses. The kitchen of Muswell Lodge lies beneath the road. The slope down which 2 figures walked one February night more than 100 winters ago lies still beneath the gravel of that road, gentle and unchanged, although no eye can any longer see it. A little way further down, the road meets at last the line of the trees. The wood is still there. The boundary of it has been re-fenced. A wooden sign at the entrance gives the wood its name. The earth bank, beyond the fence, is the same earth bank that the monks of an older century once threw up to hold their pigs in. The oaks above the bank are some of them the same oaks that stood there in the year of the murder, although their crowns have widened, and their lower branches have come down, and their roots have spread further into the deep leaf mould of the floor. A short walk into the wood brings the listener to a small clearing, beyond which the trees thicken again into the older, darker country at the heart of it. The light of the autumn afternoons comes down in long slanting bars between the trunks, and lies in pools of yellow upon the leaf mould of the floor. The wood does not know what passed along its eastern edge upon a winter night in 1896. The wood was old then, and the wood is older now, and the wood keeps its own slow long memory that is not the memory of any man. The fox lifts its head, and listens, and is gone. The owl waits in the higher branches for the dusk. The slow patient breathing of the wood goes on. This story has carried, in its long telling, only one true name that need be said again at its end, and it is the name of the man whose life was the still small centre of all of it. His name was Henry Smith. He was a retired engineer of the older school in his 79th year of life, who had spent his long working days in the years when the railways and the bridges and the pumping stations of the kingdom were rising, one after another, and who had earned in those years the careful, modest fortune that he kept by him in his last quiet decade. He had been husband, and then a widower, and a quiet keeper of his own small careful house. He had liked the cleanness of a raked gravel path. He had liked the soft hiss of a gaslight at the close of a winter afternoon. He had liked the steady small ticking of the clock upon the mantel of his hall, and the soft warm light of a coal fire seen through the open doorway of a parlour, and the careful click of a true lock turned at the end of the day. He was an old man alone in his own house when his life was taken from him on a winter night in February 1896. He was buried not long afterward, with such few mourners as could be gathered for a man who had outlived very nearly everyone who had loved him. He is remembered here now, at the close of this long telling, by his proper name, Henry Smith, of Muswell Lodge, of Tetherdown, of the parish of Hornsey, of the 79th year of his quiet life. The candle has burned low. The chamber is silent. The wood at the foot of the old slope stands as it stood. The frost gathers upon the iron of a railing that is no longer there, and history once again turns the page in the dark.